Carl Jung explained, "Healing starts when you finally choose yourself." Listen carefully, for what I am about to tell you is both the most ancient and the most personal of all human stories. It begins in the darkness, not the darkness of night or season, but the primordial darkness of the psyche itself, where all wounds are first carved into the tender flesh of being. Here, in this shadowland before conscious memory, lies the original wound that will echo through every chamber of your existence until the day you finally turn toward it with courage enough to see. You were born whole. This is not sentiment. This is archetypal truth. You emerged from the cosmic darkness carrying within you an essential nature as complete and perfect as a seed contains the entire oak. But somewhere in those early years, perhaps in a moment so subtle you cannot even name it, something happened that would change the trajectory of your entire life. Someone, somewhere communicated to you that who you were was not enough, not dramatic enough to remember as trauma, not violent enough to call abuse, but profound enough to split your world in two. The child within you learned the terrible lesson that survival itself depended upon a fundamental act of betrayal, the betrayal of your own authentic self. You discovered with the ruthless clarity that only children possess that love was conditional, that acceptance required performance, that belonging demanded the sacrifice of your essential nature upon the altar of others' comfort. And so began the great abandonment, not by others, though they played their parts, but by you of you. Jung spoke of this moment as the birth of the ego-self axis, but let us speak of it more intimately. This is the moment when the soul first learns to lie about itself, the moment when the organic truth of your being becomes something to be hidden, managed, edited for public consumption, the moment when you first chose others' approval over your own inner knowing, their comfort over your own authenticity, their peace over your own wholeness. Do not misunderstand. This was not weakness. This was survival. The child's psyche, in its infinite wisdom, recognized that to remain fully authentic in an environment that could not hold such truth was to risk something far worse than self-betrayal. It was to risk annihilation itself. And so the ego, in its protective brilliance, began its great work of adaptation, creating the first of what would become an endless series of masks, personas, false selves designed to secure what the authentic self could not: safety, love, belonging. But here is the tragic irony that Jung understood so clearly. What begins as protection becomes prison. What starts as adaptation becomes addiction. The very mechanisms that once saved us eventually become the instruments of our own destruction. The child who learned to be good in order to be loved becomes the adult who does not know the difference between goodness and self-erasure. The child who discovered that being small meant being safe becomes the adult who cannot access their own power without feeling like they are betraying everyone they have ever loved. In the unconscious, nothing is ever lost. Every moment of self-abandonment is recorded with perfect precision. Every time you chose to be who others needed you to be rather than who you actually were. Every instance where you swallowed your truth to keep the peace. Every occasion when you dimmed your light so others would not feel threatened by its brightness. The psyche keeps perfect accounting, and the bill grows heavier with each passing year. You learned to read the room before you learned to read your own heart. You mastered the art of emotional shape-shifting before you ever discovered what your own shape actually was. You became fluent in the language of others' needs while remaining foreign to the dialect of your own desires. This is how the great abandonment deepens itself. Not through single moments of dramatic betrayal, but through 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 tiny deaths of authenticity, 1,000 subtle capitulations to the collective's demand that you be anything other than what you truly are. The personas we develop in response to this original wound become more real to us than our authentic selves. The good daughter, the perfect partner, the successful professional, the selfless mother. These masks feel more familiar than the face beneath them. We know their preferences, their boundaries, their ways of moving through the world. We have invested decades in perfecting their performances, but the one who wears them, she has become a stranger, a half-remembered dream, a whisper we can barely hear beneath the cacophony of who we think we should be. Jung called this the provisional life, the life we live while waiting for our real life to begin. But what he understood, and what we must come to understand, is that our real life cannot begin until we stop abandoning ourselves. It cannot emerge until we recognize that every external abandonment we have experienced has been preceded by an internal one. Every rejection we have received from the world has been a mirror of the rejection we have been perpetrating against our own authentic nature. The shadow of self-abandonment grows in direct proportion to our unconsciousness of it. The more we deny our complicity in our own betrayal, the more power it holds over us. The more we blame others for not seeing us, not understanding us, not valuing us, the more we avoid the terrible and liberating truth that we have not been seeing, understanding, or valuing ourselves. We have been so busy being who we thought we should be that we have forgotten entirely who we actually are. This forgetting is not passive. It requires active maintenance. Every day, in countless small ways, we choose the familiar prison of self-betrayal over the terrifying freedom of authenticity. We choose the known misery of being unseen over the unknown possibility of being truly witnessed. We choose the comfortable lie of our personas over the uncomfortable truth of our essential nature. And we make these choices so automatically, so unconsciously, that we believe them to be imposed upon us from the outside. But the unconscious does not forget. In dreams, in symptoms, in the places where our carefully constructed lives begin to crack and crumble, our abandoned selves send signals. Depression is often the soul's protest against a life that does not reflect our true nature. Anxiety is frequently the psyche's alarm system, alerting us to the increasing distance between who we are pretending to be and who we actually are. Rage is sometimes the authentic self's final attempt to break through the layers of compliance and people-pleasing that have buried it alive. Jung understood that these symptoms are not pathologies to be eliminated, but messages to be decoded. They are the abandoned self's way of making herself known, of refusing to remain indefinitely in exile. The more we medicate them away, therapy them into silence, or positive think them out of existence, the more desperately they call for our attention, because what wants to be healed is not the symptom, but the fundamental split that created it, the original choice to abandon ourselves in favor of who we thought we needed to be. The healing journey cannot begin with trying to feel better about our abandonment of ourselves. It cannot start with affirmations or visualizations or any other attempt to bypass the fundamental reckoning that must occur. It begins with the courage to look directly at the ways we have been complicit in our own betrayal. It starts with acknowledging that we have been so afraid of being abandoned by others that we have preemptively abandoned ourselves. It commences with the recognition that we have been so terrified of being rejected that we have rejected the very parts of ourselves that make rejection impossible. Because what is authentic cannot be rejected. It can only be seen or not seen, met or not met, but never diminished by another's inability to recognize its worth. This acknowledgement is not about blame. It is about reclaiming power. As long as we believe that our abandonment is something that happened to us, rather than something we participated in, we remain victims of our own story. But when we recognize our role in the great abandonment, we simultaneously recognize our power to end it. When we see how we have been choosing others' comfort over our own authenticity, we can begin to make different choices. When we understand how we have been prioritizing external approval over internal alignment, we can start to shift our allegiance back to our own souls. The return to authenticity is not a gentle path. It requires us to face not only what was done to us, but what we have done to ourselves. It demands that we feel the full weight of all the years we spent in exile from our own truth. It asks us to grieve not only for the love we did not receive, but for the love we did not give ourselves. It insists that we mourn not only for the acceptance we were denied, but for the acceptance we denied our own essential nature. But this grief, when fully felt, becomes the compost from which new life grows. This reckoning, when honestly faced, becomes the foundation upon which authentic selfhood can finally be built. This return to the scene of our original self-betrayal becomes the doorway through which we can finally come home to who we have always been beneath the layers of who we thought we should be. The great abandonment of self is both our deepest wound and our greatest teacher. It shows us the price we pay for living outside ourselves. It reveals the cost of prioritizing external harmony over internal coherence. It demonstrates the futility of trying to earn love by being anything other than who we truly are. And ultimately, it points us toward the only real solution: the decision to stop abandoning ourselves regardless of who else might choose to stay or leave, approve or disapprove, understand or remain confused by our choice, to finally come home. Now we must examine the masterpiece of psychological architecture that the ego constructs in response to that original wound. Layer upon layer of adaptation, each one more sophisticated than the last, until we have built ourselves a palace of self-betrayal so beautiful that even we forget it is a prison. Watch how it begins. The first brick is laid with such innocent precision. The discovery that certain parts of you are welcomed while others are met with silence, tension, or withdrawal. The child's psyche, with its exquisite sensitivity to emotional atmosphere, immediately begins the great work of cataloging. This expression of joy is too loud. This display of anger is too threatening. This moment of sadness is too inconvenient. This burst of excitement is too overwhelming. This need for attention is too demanding. And so the ego, in its infinite creativity, begins to architect solutions. If authentic joy is too much, we will learn to manufacture something smaller, more palatable, a gentle smile that doesn't ask too much of anyone. If our natural anger is too frightening, we will compress it into something more socially acceptable, perhaps depression, which hurts only ourselves, or passive aggression, which expresses rage while maintaining plausible deniability. If our genuine sadness makes others uncomfortable, we will transform it into strength, resilience, the ability to handle anything without ever needing comfort or care. Each adaptation becomes a new floor in the building of our false self. The good daughter who learns that her worth lies in her ability to make others comfortable. The perfect partner who masters the art of anticipating needs before they are even spoken. The successful professional who discovers that achievement can substitute for authentic connection. The selfless mother who finds in service to others a way to feel valuable while never having to risk being known. Layer by layer, compromise by compromise, we construct an elaborate architecture of self-betrayal. And here is the tragic genius of it. Each layer is built to solve the problems created by the layer beneath it. The good daughter must become the perfect partner because being good was never quite good enough. The perfect partner must become the successful professional because perfection in relationship still left a terrible emptiness. The successful professional must become the selfless mother, because achievement alone could not fill the void where authentic selfhood should have been. Jung understood this process with crystalline clarity. He saw how the persona, the mask we wear for the world, begins as protection but evolves into possession. What starts as conscious adaptation becomes unconscious identification. We do not merely wear the mask, we become convinced that we are the mask. The boundary between who we are pretending to be and who we believe ourselves to be dissolves so completely that we experience any threat to the persona as a threat to our very existence. But the authentic self does not disappear. It cannot be destroyed, only buried. And the deeper we bury it beneath our beautiful adaptations, the more sophisticated our architecture of self-betrayal must become to contain its persistent stirrings. Like a house built over a powerful underground spring, our carefully constructed personas require constant maintenance to prevent the authentic self from breaking through and flooding everything we have worked so hard to build. The unconscious keeps perfect accounting of every choice we make to prioritize the persona over the authentic self. Every moment we smile when we want to scream. Every instance we say yes when everything in us is crying no. Every time we diminish ourselves to make others comfortable. Every occasion we betray our own knowing to maintain external harmony. The shadow ledger grows heavier with each entry, and the weight of it begins to affect every aspect of our lives. Notice how the architecture evolves to accommodate this growing weight. We develop more sophisticated methods of self-monitoring, more elaborate systems for reading and responding to others' emotional needs, while remaining oblivious to our own. We perfect the art of emotional shapeshifting, becoming whoever the moment requires us to be, with such skill that even we lose track of our original shape. We master the ability to disappear into others' realities so completely that we forget we ever had a reality of our own. The personas we create are not random. They are precise responses to specific environments, crafted with the unconscious wisdom that understands exactly what each situation requires for survival. The child who grows up in chaos becomes the adult who can handle any crisis with unnatural calm. The child who is overwhelmed by others' emotions becomes the adult who cannot access her own feelings without feeling guilty for being selfish. The child who must be the family's source of light becomes the adult who cannot allow herself to be sad without feeling like she is failing everyone who depends on her brightness. Each persona develops its own internal logic, its own set of rules, its own way of interpreting reality. The good daughter sees everything through the lens of how it affects others. The perfect partner experiences every relationship dynamic as a reflection of her adequacy or inadequacy. The successful professional measures every moment against standards of productivity and achievement. The selfless mother cannot distinguish between love and self-sacrifice, between caring for others and erasing herself. But here is what Jung saw so clearly. These personas, however skillfully crafted, can never fully satisfy the needs they were designed to meet. The good daughter can never be good enough to guarantee love, because love that must be earned is not love at all. The perfect partner can never be perfect enough to prevent abandonment, because perfection is not what creates lasting connection. The successful professional can never achieve enough to fill the void where authentic self-worth should reside. The selfless mother can never sacrifice enough to feel truly valuable, because self-sacrifice without self-knowledge is merely another form of self-abandonment, and so the architecture must become even more elaborate. We add new rooms, new floors, new wings to accommodate the ever-growing list of ways we must be different from who we are in order to get what we need. We develop backup personas for when our primary masks fail, We create sophisticated early warning systems to detect any sign that our adaptations might not be working. We build increasingly complex internal surveillance networks to monitor and control any spontaneous emergence of authentic selfhood that might threaten the stability of our carefully constructed false self. The energy required to maintain this architecture becomes enormous. Every conversation must be filtered through multiple personas to determine which response is most appropriate. Every emotion must be checked against an internal database of what is allowed, when it is allowed, and in what quantity it can be safely expressed. Every impulse toward authenticity must be evaluated for its potential impact on the persona before it can be permitted into consciousness. Is it any wonder that we become so tired? Is it any surprise that we begin to feel like strangers in our own lives? The architecture of self-betrayal requires so much of our life force to maintain that little remains for the actual living of our lives. We become like homeowners who spend so much time and energy maintaining a house they can no longer afford that they forget why they wanted a home in the first place. But the authentic self, exiled beneath all these layers of adaptation, does not remain silent forever. It begins to send signals through the only channels available to it. The body that holds tension in places personas cannot reach. The dreams that speak in symbols personas cannot interpret. The symptoms that manifest in ways personas cannot control. Depression becomes the authentic self's strike against a life that does not reflect its truth. Anxiety becomes its alarm system, warning of the increasing distance between who we are pretending to be and who we actually are. Physical illness becomes its final resort, forcing us to stop long enough to potentially hear what it has been trying to tell us for decades. The beginning of healing lies in recognizing the beauty and the tragedy of what we have built. These personas, these elaborate architectures of self-betrayal, represent some of the most sophisticated psychological engineering ever accomplished. They have kept us alive, kept us functioning, kept us connected to others in whatever way seemed possible at the time. They deserve our respect and gratitude, even as we begin to recognize their limitations. But we must also acknowledge the cost. We must face what we have become in our determination to be what we thought others needed us to be. We must mourn the authentic self that has been buried beneath all our beautiful adaptations. We must grieve the life we might have lived if we had been brave enough to be ourselves from the beginning. The dismantling of this architecture cannot happen overnight. Each layer was built for reasons that once made perfect sense. Each persona served important functions that may still be relevant. The good daughter may need to learn how to care for others without abandoning herself. The perfect partner may need to discover how to be in relationship without losing herself. The successful professional may need to find ways to achieve that honor her authentic nature. The selfless mother may need to explore how to serve others from a place of wholeness rather than emptiness. But dismantling must begin brick by brick, layer by layer, with the same precision and care that went into the original construction. It begins with the radical act of noticing when we are being who we think we should be rather than who we actually are. It continues with the courage to pause in those moments and ask ourselves what our authentic response might be. It deepens with the willingness to risk others' disapproval in service of our own inner truth. The architecture of self-betrayal is both our greatest creation and our deepest prison. It represents the extent of our creativity in service of survival and the extent of our suffering in service of acceptance. But it is not permanent. What we have built, we can unbuild. What we have chosen, we can choose differently. The question is not whether we have the power to change. The very existence of such elaborate personas proves our creative capacity. The question is whether we have the courage to use that same creative power in service of our authentic self, rather than in service of our adapted self. We must now venture into darker waters, into the realm where personal shadow meets collective shadow, where individual self-abandonment merges with ancient patterns that have been shaping human consciousness for millennia. Here, in the depths of what Jung called the collective unconscious, swims a leviathan of such power that it has convinced entire civilizations that self-sacrifice is the highest virtue, that diminishment is love, that the erasure of one's authentic nature is the price of belonging to the human family. Listen carefully, for what I am about to reveal may shake the very foundations of what you have been taught to believe about goodness, love, and righteousness. The collective shadow does not announce itself with obvious malevolence. It comes wearing the mask of virtue, speaking the language of morality, wrapping itself in the robes of the sacred. It whispers that to choose yourself is selfish, that to honor your own needs is narcissistic, that to express your authentic truth is a betrayal of love itself. This is not a modern phenomenon. This pattern reaches back through the archetypal layers of human experience, embedded in the very myths and stories that have shaped consciousness for thousands of years. The woman who sacrifices herself for others is canonized as saint. The mother who disappears into her children's needs is celebrated as the epitome of love. The daughter who never leaves her parents' side is praised for her devotion. The wife who makes herself smaller so her partner can feel larger is admired for her selflessness. But Jung understood what lurks beneath this glorification of self-sacrifice, a collective terror of authentic feminine power, a deep fear of what happens when individuals, particularly women, refuse to make themselves smaller for others' comfort. The collective shadow has invested enormous energy in convincing women that their worth lies not in who they are, but in their capacity to diminish themselves for others. It has created elaborate mythologies that equate self-erasure with love, self-abandonment with virtue, self-betrayal with spiritual achievement. Watch how this shadow operates through the collective structures that surround us. Families that label the authentic child as difficult or selfish, while praising the one who has learned to disappear into others' needs. Cultures that celebrate women who have no boundaries, no needs, no authentic desires of their own. Religious traditions that equate suffering with holiness, sacrifice with love, martyrdom with spiritual advancement. Social systems that depend upon individuals who do not know their own worth, who mistake exhaustion for righteousness, who confuse depletion with devotion. The collective shadow speaks through 1,000 voices, and all of them sound like love. If you really loved me, you would. A good woman always puts others first. Mothers are supposed to sacrifice for their children. Selfishness is the root of all evil. True love means never thinking of yourself. These messages saturate the psychological atmosphere we breathe, so pervasive that we mistake them for truth rather than recognizing them as the collective's attempt to maintain a system that requires the self-abandonment of its participants. Jung saw clearly how the collective unconscious operates through what he called autonomous complexes, patterns of thought and behavior that possess a life of their own, operating through individuals while remaining largely unconscious to them. The self-sacrifice complex is one of the most powerful of these autonomous patterns, particularly as it moves through the feminine psyche. It has the ability to completely possess consciousness, making the individual believe that her worth depends entirely upon her capacity to serve others, to meet others' needs, to make others comfortable, even at the cost of her own authentic existence. This complex does not operate randomly. It has its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own methods of perpetuation. It seeks out the most sensitive, the most empathetic, the most naturally caring individuals and transforms their greatest gifts into instruments of their own destruction. The woman with the deepest capacity for love becomes convinced that love means self-erasure. The one with the strongest intuitive abilities becomes focused exclusively on reading and meeting others' needs while remaining blind to her own. The one with the most natural wisdom becomes convinced that speaking her truth is selfish, that honoring her own knowing is narcissistic. Notice how the collective shadow maintains itself through the generations. The mother who has been taught that her worth lies in her sacrifice teaches her daughter the same lesson, not through conscious cruelty but through unconscious modeling. The daughter watches her mother disappear into the family's needs and learns that this is what love looks like. She observes her mother's boundaries dissolving in service to others and concludes that boundaries are selfish. She witnesses her mother's authentic self being sacrificed on the altar of everyone else's comfort and assumes that this sacrifice is both necessary and noble. The tragedy deepens because those who have been most completely possessed by the self-sacrifice complex become its most passionate advocates. Having lost themselves so completely in service to others, they cannot tolerate the sight of someone who refuses to make the same sacrifice. The mother who has abandoned herself for her family cannot bear to watch her daughter choose herself. The woman who has erased herself for her partner cannot stand to see her friend set boundaries in her own relationship. The colleague who has sacrificed her authentic truth for professional success cannot tolerate someone who refuses to compromise their integrity for advancement. This is how the collective shadow maintains its power, by turning its victims into its enforcers. Those who have paid the highest price for belonging to the system become most invested in ensuring that others pay the same price. They become the guardians of the collective's demand for self-sacrifice, the ones who will shame, guilt, and manipulate others back into compliance whenever they show signs of choosing themselves over the collective's needs. But Jung also understood that the collective shadow carries within itself the seeds of its own transformation. The very intensity of its demand for self-sacrifice creates an equal and opposite force in the unconscious, a deep longing for authenticity, a passionate desire for genuine selfhood, a fierce determination to reclaim what has been lost. This is what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of any psychological extreme to eventually transform into its opposite. The collective shadow of self-sacrifice has created its own antithesis, a growing awakening to the toxic nature of systems that require individuals to abandon themselves in order to belong. More and more people are beginning to recognize that what they have been taught to call love is often manipulation in disguise, that what they have been told is virtue is frequently coercion wearing the mask of morality, that what they have been convinced is necessary for belonging is actually the very thing that prevents genuine connection from ever occurring. This awakening is not comfortable. It requires us to question everything we have been taught about goodness, love, and virtue. It demands that we examine the ways we have been complicit in perpetuating systems that require self-abandonment. It asks us to face the possibility that much of what we have called love has been conditional acceptance, dependent upon our willingness to be other than who we are. The collective shadow does not release its hold easily. As we begin to withdraw our energy from the self-sacrifice complex, we may find ourselves facing enormous pressure to return to our old patterns. Family members may intensify their demands. Partners may become threatened by our growing authenticity. Friends may withdraw their approval. Colleagues may label us as difficult or selfish. The collective will marshal every resource at its disposal to pull us back into compliance with its demand for self-erasure. This is when we must understand that we are not healing only for ourselves. Every time we choose authenticity over approval, we weaken the collective shadow's hold on human consciousness. Every moment we honor our own truth instead of sacrificing it for others' comfort, we create a crack in the system that requires self-abandonment for belonging. Every instance we choose self-love over self-sacrifice, we contribute to the collective healing that is desperately needed on this planet. Jung knew that the transformation of the collective shadow begins with individuals who are willing to face their own complicity in perpetuating it. We must examine the ways we have used others' self-sacrifice for our own comfort. We must acknowledge how we have been threatened by those who refuse to abandon themselves for our needs. We must face the ways we have shamed and manipulated others back into compliance when their authenticity made us uncomfortable. But we must also recognize that we did not create this system. The collective shadow of self-sacrifice is ancient, archetypal, embedded in the very structures of civilization itself. We inherited it, just as those before us inherited it from those before them. The difference is that we now have the consciousness to recognize it for what it is. Not love, not virtue, not spiritual advancement, but a collective pathology that has been masquerading as health for so long that we have forgotten what genuine wellness looks like. The healing begins when we stop believing that love requires the erasure of self. It deepens when we recognize that authentic connection is only possible between individuals who know who they are and are willing to be that in relationship with others. It continues when we understand that true service flows from wholeness, not emptiness, that we can only give to others what we have first given to ourselves. The collective shadow will resist this healing with every weapon at its disposal. It will call us selfish for choosing ourselves. It will label us narcissistic for honoring our own needs. It will accuse us of betraying love when we refuse to abandon ourselves for others' comfort. But these accusations are the death throes of a system that has outlived its usefulness, the last desperate attempts of a collective pattern that knows its time is ending. We are living through the enantiodromia of the self-sacrifice complex, the collective shadow that has convinced generations of individuals, particularly women, that their worth lay in their capacity for self-erasure, is beginning to transform into its opposite, a collective awakening to the sacred value of authentic selfhood, a growing recognition that genuine love requires the presence of two whole individuals, a deepening understanding that the healing of the world depends not upon our willingness to sacrifice ourselves, but upon our courage to be ourselves. The question is not whether this transformation will occur. The archetypal forces are already in motion, and what has been set in motion at this level of the psyche cannot be stopped. The question is whether we will participate consciously in this healing or remain unconscious victims of patterns we do not understand. The choice, as always in matters of the soul, is ours to make. In the beginning, there was silence, the profound silence of the unborn self, resting in its own completeness, needing nothing, seeking nothing, whole unto itself. But somewhere along the way, in the great forgetting that marks our descent into incarnation, we learn to listen for other voices. We learn to turn our ears away from the quiet wisdom that speaks from the depths of our own being and toward the clamoring chorus of the world, seeking in its cacophony what we had somehow lost in ourselves. This is the great seduction of our time, the building of temples not to the gods that dwell within, but to the false deities that promise salvation from without. In the market square of modern consciousness, we have erected altars to opinions that are not our own, shrines to approval that must be earned again and again, never once and for all. We bow before the glowing screens that reflect back to us not our true face, but the face we think the world wishes to see. Listen, dear soul, to the sound of your own heart beating. Can you hear it beneath the noise of notifications, beneath the whisper of what they might think, beneath the endless scroll of comparisons that steal your peace? Can you remember, even for a moment, what it felt like to exist without needing to justify that existence to anyone at all? The temple of the ego is a magnificent structure, built with the stones of our deepest insecurities and mortared with the tears of our unmet longings. Within its walls, false gods hold court, each one promising what the others have failed to deliver. Here sits the deity of others' opinions, that most seductive of idols, whose voice grows louder the more we feed it with our attention. This God speaks in whispers at first. What will they think? What will they say? But with each offering of our authentic self that we place upon its altar, its voice becomes a roar that drowns out everything else. The hunger of this false god is insatiable. No amount of approval can ever satisfy it completely, for it feeds not on what is given, but on what is withheld. It thrives in the spaces between praise, in the silence after compliments, in the pause before judgment. It teaches us to measure our worth not by the steady rhythm of our own hearts, but by the erratic pulse of external validation, leaving us forever dependent upon sources beyond our control. And beside this deity sits another, the god of social media approval, that modern Moloch that devours authenticity and excretes performance. This digital deity has mastered the art of intermittent reinforcement, offering just enough recognition to keep us coming back, just enough validation to make us forget that we once knew how to validate ourselves. In its temple, we learn the strange alchemy of transforming lived experience into curated content, of converting genuine moments into posts that might garner the likes that temporarily silence our inner critic. Watch how the soul contorts itself in service to this God. See how it learns to experience life through the lens of how it might be received, how it begins to live not in the present moment, but in the anticipated future of response and reaction. The sunset becomes not a moment of beauty to be absorbed, but a photo opportunity to be shared. The achievement becomes not a personal milestone to be savored, but a post to be crafted for maximum engagement. This is the particular cruelty of our digital age. We have taken the ancient human need for connection and community and perverted it into a transaction, a marketplace where authenticity is currency and approval is the prize. We have forgotten that true connection arises not from performance, but from presence, not from perfection, but from the courage to be genuinely, messily, beautifully human. But there is yet another altar in this temple of false validation, perhaps the most convincing of all, the idol of professional achievement that promises worth through external accomplishment. This god speaks the language of progress, of ladder climbing, of becoming someone who matters in the eyes of the world. It whispers seductively of titles and recognition, of salary and status, of the moment when we will finally have achieved enough to feel worthy of our own existence. The devotees of this god sacrifice their days upon its altar, offering up their hours and their energy, their relationships and their rest, their joy and their wonder, all in service to the promise that somewhere ahead lies the achievement that will finally make them enough. They mistake motion for meaning, busyness for purpose, external recognition for internal worth. They climb mountains not because the mountain calls to their soul, but because reaching the summit might finally silence the voice that tells them they are not yet worthy of love, especially their own. These archetypal forces that Jung recognized as autonomous complexes within the psyche do not merely suggest, they seduce. They do not simply influence, they possess. They become the lens through which we see ourselves and the world, coloring every experience with the particular hue of their demands. Under their influence, we lose the capacity to know ourselves from the inside out. We become strangers to our own authentic desires, our own natural rhythms, our own inner compass. The mechanism Jung called projection becomes the invisible thread by which these false gods maintain their power over us. We cast our own inherent worth, that birthright of consciousness itself, out into the world, onto others, onto achievements, onto the fleeting approval of strangers and acquaintances alike. We give away our power to validate ourselves and then spend our lives in desperate pursuit of its return, not recognizing that what we seek was never actually lost, only temporarily misplaced in the projective act itself. This is the great psychological sleight of hand of our time. We convince ourselves that our worth exists somewhere outside of us, in the hands of others, in the fruits of our labor, in the reflection we see in the mirror of social media. We forget that worth is not earned but inherent, not achieved but recognized, not given but already present in the very fact of our existence. The soul that has given its power away to these false gods' lives in a state of perpetual hunger, forever seeking the next fix of validation, the next hit of approval, the next achievement that might finally fill the void that seems to exist at its center. But this void is not actually empty. It only appears so when we abandon it in favor of seeking fulfillment elsewhere. It is like a house whose inhabitants have fled, leaving it to appear vacant when in truth it simply awaits their return. In the depths of this abandonment, the authentic self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, grows weak from neglect. Like a flame that has been deprived of oxygen, it flickers and dims, though it never fully dies. It sends out signals from the depths, symptoms and dreams, slips of the tongue and moments of inexplicable sadness, all attempting to call us back to the truth of who we are beneath the masks we wear for the world. The healing journey begins with the recognition that we are in exile from ourselves, that we have become refugees from our own inner landscape, seeking asylum in the opinions and approval of others. This recognition often comes not as a gentle dawning, but as a crisis, the moment when the external sources of validation suddenly fail us, when the false gods reveal their powerlessness to actually sustain us, when the hollow echo of our own voice bouncing back from the walls of the temple finally becomes audible to our own ears. This is the dark night of the soul that precedes all authentic transformation, the moment when we realize that everything we have been seeking outside ourselves has been a substitute for what we abandoned within ourselves. It is the moment of great disillusionment, which is also the moment of great possibility, for it is only when we stop believing in false solutions that we become available to discover real ones. The work of reclaiming our relationship with our own worth is not gentle work. It requires what Jung called enantiodromia, the running in the opposite direction, the conscious reversal of the flow of psychic energy. Where we have been accustomed to looking outward for validation, we must learn to look inward. Where we have been trained to defer to the opinions of others, we must learn to consult the wisdom of our own depths. Where we have become addicted to external feedback, we must learn to generate our own sense of recognition and approval. This is the great iconoclasm that healing requires, the deliberate shattering of the false gods that have held us in thrall, the conscious withdrawal of our projections, the patient work of calling our power back from all the places we have scattered it throughout our lives. It is archaeological work, excavating the self from beneath layers of adaptation and performance, beneath years of learning to be who we thought we needed to be rather than who we actually are. The process begins with the simple but revolutionary act of listening to our own voice, of learning to distinguish between the authentic whisper of our deeper wisdom and the loud demands of the false gods. This requires developing what we might call internal discernment, the capacity to sense what is truly ours and what has been imposed upon us by others' expectations, society's demands, or our own internalized need for approval. In the silence between thoughts, in the space between breaths, in the pause between stimulus and response, the authentic self makes itself known. It speaks not in the commanding tones of the false gods, but in whispers, in hunches, in the subtle pull of what truly matters to us beneath the noise of what we think should matter. It communicates through the body's wisdom, the yes that expands our chest, the no that contracts our stomach, the rightness that settles into our bones when we align with what is true for us. Learning to hear this voice requires a kind of courage that our culture does not teach. The courage to be unimpressive to others if it means being authentic to ourselves. The courage to disappoint those whose approval we have been seeking if it means honoring what is true within us. The courage to appear ordinary in the eyes of the world if it means feeling extraordinary in our own experience. This is not the courage of the hero who slays the dragon to win the treasure, but the quieter courage of the one who stops running toward false promises and turns to face what is actually here, in this moment, in this life, in this imperfect but irreplaceable experience of being exactly who we are. It is the courage to validate our own experience, to trust our own perceptions, to honor our own process even when it makes no sense to anyone else. The sacred relationship between ego and self that Jung spoke of is not a relationship between two separate entities, but the recognition that the ego, our conscious personality, is meant to serve as a transparent vessel for the larger self, the deeper wisdom that exists beneath and beyond our everyday awareness. When the ego becomes inflated by external validation, it loses this transparency. It becomes opaque, blocking the light of the self rather than allowing it to shine through. The deflation of the ego that comes with the recognition of our addiction to external validation is not a punishment but a liberation. It is the removal of the false responsibilities we have taken on, the responsibility to be impressive, to be perfect, to be worthy of love through our achievements rather than through our simple existence. This deflation creates space for the authentic relationship between ego and self to emerge, a relationship characterized not by performance but by presence, not by earning but by being. In this relationship, the ego learns to serve not the false gods of external validation, but the deeper wisdom of the self. It becomes a servant rather than a master, a vessel rather than a god, a function of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. This is not a diminishment but a right-sizing, a return to proper relationship with the source of our actual power and worth. The recognition that the validation we seek outside ourselves can only be authentically found within is not merely an intellectual understanding, but a living reality that must be embodied, practiced, and integrated into every aspect of our daily existence. It means learning to celebrate our own achievements before sharing them with others, learning to comfort ourselves in disappointment before seeking comfort elsewhere, learning to see ourselves with compassion before asking for compassion from the world. This internal validation is not self-deception or spiritual bypassing, but a mature recognition of our own authority over our inner landscape. It is the acknowledgement that while others may have opinions about us, only we can determine our worth. While others may offer feedback about our actions, only we can evaluate our intentions. While others may judge our choices, Only we can know the fullness of our circumstances and the depth of our considerations. The practice of internal validation requires us to develop new muscles of self-awareness and self-compassion. We must learn to catch ourselves in the act of seeking approval and gently redirect our attention inward. We must learn to notice when we are performing rather than being, and choose authenticity even when it feels risky. We must learn to validate our own feelings and experiences even when they do not match what others expect or want from us. This is delicate work, requiring the patience of a gardener who tends to tender shoots, the persistence of a musician learning a new instrument, the faith of a traveler walking an unmarked path. There will be moments when the old patterns reassert themselves, when the false gods call out to us with renewed urgency, when the familiar pain of seeking validation elsewhere seems preferable to the unfamiliar work of creating it ourselves. But with each small act of self-validation, with each moment of choosing our own authentic response over the response we think others want, with each instance of listening to our own voice rather than the chorus of external opinion, we strengthen the sacred relationship between ego and self. We rebuild the temple not to false gods, but to the true divinity that dwells within the depths of our own being. This true divinity does not demand constant worship or endless sacrifice. It does not require us to be perfect or impressive or worthy in the eyes of others. It asks only that we remember who we are beneath all the roles we play, that we honor what we know in the depths of our bones, that we love ourselves with the same fierce tenderness we would offer to a beloved child who is learning to walk in a complicated world. The shattering of false gods is ultimately an act of love, love for the authentic self that has been waiting patiently beneath the masks of adaptation and performance, love for the truth that exists independent of others, recognition or approval, love for the irreplaceable uniqueness of our particular way of being human in this world. It is the recognition that we are not here to earn our worth through external achievement, but to discover it through internal recognition. Not here to become someone impressive, but to remember someone irreplaceable. Ourselves, exactly as we are, in all our beautiful, broken, perfectly imperfect humanity. And in this remembering, in this return to the truth of our inherent worth, we find that the validation we sought so desperately from others is and has always been available from within. We find that the love we tried to earn through achievement is our birthright, requiring nothing more than our willingness to receive it. We find that the acceptance we begged for from the world is something we can offer ourselves, completely and unconditionally, in any moment we choose to come home to who we truly are. Before we knew we were separate beings, before we understood that we ended where the world began, we existed in the oceanic embrace of undifferentiated love. In that primordial space before language, before judgment, before the long education and shame that would follow, we simply were, luminous, worthy, whole. We did not question our right to exist, our worthiness of care, our fundamental okayness in the universe. We were the center of our own cosmos, not from arrogance but from innocence, not from entitlement but from the simple truth that love was the medium in which we swam. But then came the moment of awakening that was also the moment of exile. The first time we reached for love and found absence. The first time we offered our authentic self and met with disapproval. The first time we discovered that our natural way of being in the world was somehow wrong, too much, not enough, fundamentally flawed in ways we could not yet understand but would spend a lifetime trying to correct. This is where the deepest wounds are carved into the soft flesh of the developing soul, in that sacred space where we should have been met with unconditional positive regard, where our emerging selfhood should have been celebrated rather than corrected, where we should have learned that love was not something to be earned, but something that was ours by birthright. Instead, we learned our first lessons in conditional acceptance, in the terrible arithmetic of worth that would govern so much of our adult lives. The mother wound cuts with surgical precision into the heart of our capacity for self-nurturing, for trusting our own needs, for believing we deserve to take up space in the world. She who was meant to be our first mirror, reflecting back to us our inherent beauty and worthiness, instead became a distorting glass that showed us only what was lacking, what needed fixing, what was somehow inadequate in our essential nature. Perhaps she could not see us because she had never been truly seen herself. Perhaps she could not love our wildness because her own had been tamed into submission. Perhaps she could not celebrate our sensitivity because she had learned that tenderness was a luxury she could not afford. The mother wound is rarely born of malice, but of the unconscious passing down of unlived life, unhealed trauma, the accumulated grief of generations of women who learned to cut away pieces of themselves to fit into a world that demanded their diminishment. But the child does not understand this complexity. The child only knows that the one who was supposed to love them without condition has instead become a source of criticism, of endless suggestions for improvement, of the subtle but devastating message that their natural way of being is somehow insufficient. The child learns to edit themselves, to perform a version of selfhood that might finally earn the love that should never have been in question. Listen to the voice of the wounded child within you, that part of your psyche that still carries the echo of every time your authentic expression was met with disappointment rather than delight. Can you hear it whispering its ancient questions? Am I too much? Am I not enough? What do I need to change about myself to be worthy of love? These questions, formed in the crucible of early relationship, become the lens through which we see ourselves for decades to come. The mother who could not see us teaches us not to see ourselves. We learn to look at ourselves through her critical gaze, rather than through the lens of our own self-compassion. We internalize her voice as the voice of truth, rather than recognizing it as the voice of her own unhealed wounds. We make her limitations our reality, her fears our prophecy, her unlived dreams our burden to carry, or her unfulfilled expectations our impossible standard to meet. This is how the internal critical voice is born, not as our own wisdom, but as the internalized judgment of the one who was meant to teach us that we were lovable exactly as we were. We carry her voice within us like a foreign object that our psychological immune system never learned to reject, allowing it to speak with the authority of truth when it is actually the voice of trauma seeking to perpetuate itself across generations. The father wound cuts along different lines, but with equal depth, severing us from our sense of personal power, our right to take up space, our trust in our own authority and capability. He who was meant to be our champion, our protector, our guide into the larger world, instead became a judge of our worthiness, a critic of our strength, a measuring stick against which we would forever find ourselves lacking. Perhaps he could not accept us because he had never been accepted in his own vulnerable humanity. Perhaps he could not celebrate our uniqueness because his own had been ridiculed into hiding. Perhaps he could not offer us unconditional approval because he was still seeking it himself from his own internal father who had likewise failed to provide it. The father wound too is rarely personal, but archetypal, part of the collective masculine shadow that mistakes dominance for strength, criticism for guidance, emotional distance for protection. The child who reaches for their father's approval and finds instead judgment learns that love must be earned through achievement, that worth is something that must be proven rather than simply recognized. They learn to perform competence rather than trust their natural capabilities, to seek validation for their efforts rather than find satisfaction in their being, to measure themselves against impossible standards rather than honor their own unique path of development. The Father Wound teaches us not to trust our own inner authority. We learn to look outside ourselves for permission to be who we are, for validation of our choices, for approval of our direction. We become eternal children seeking the good opinion of external authorities rather than mature adults, capable of consulting our own inner wisdom and trusting what we find there. These primal wounds, the failure to be truly seen by the mother, the failure to be unconditionally accepted by the father, become the template through which we learn to relate not only to others but, most devastatingly, to ourselves. We treat ourselves the way we were treated, love ourselves the way we were loved, accept ourselves to the degree we were accepted. The inner voices that speak against self-love are not our own, but the internalized echoes of those who could not love us for who we truly were. They whisper the old familiar refrains. You're too sensitive. You're not trying hard enough. What will people think? You should be grateful for what you have. Stop being so dramatic. You're too needy. You're not smart enough. You'll never amount to anything. These voices become what Jung called complexes, autonomous clusters of psychic energy that operate like separate personalities within the unconscious mind. They have their own agenda, their own logic, their own power to influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They sabotage our attempts at self-love not because they are evil, but because they are trying to protect us from the pain of rejection by ensuring we never fully accept ourselves, and therefore never risk offering our authentic selves to others. The mother complex carries the voice of criticism disguised as care. I'm only trying to help you, it says, as it points out everything that could be improved about us. I want what's best for you, it whispers, as it undermines our confidence in our own choices. You could be so much more if only, it sighs, ensuring we never feel we are enough exactly as we are in this moment. The father complex speaks in the language of impossibly high standards and conditional approval. You haven't worked hard enough, it declares, regardless of our efforts. Others are doing better than you, it observes, making sure we never rest in our own accomplishments. You should be further along by now, it judges, stealing from us the gift of patience with our own process. These complexes operate below the threshold of consciousness, influencing our inner dialogue, our self-perception, our capacity for self-compassion without our awareness. They create an internal environment that replicates the emotional atmosphere of our childhood, ensuring that we continue to experience the familiar pain of not being good enough even in the absence of external criticism. The healing of these wounds begins with the radical recognition that the voice of criticism within us is not the voice of truth. It is not our own wisdom speaking, but the internalized trauma of those who raised us, the echo of their own unhealed wounds, reverberating through our psyche. This recognition is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means we are not actually fundamentally flawed. Terrifying because it means we must learn to parent ourselves in ways we were never parented. Jung understood that these complexes maintain their power through unconsciousness. As long as we remain unaware of their operation, they continue to function autonomously, sabotaging our well-being from the shadows. But when we bring them into conscious dialogue, when we learn to recognize their voice and distinguish it from our own authentic inner wisdom, they begin to lose their grip on our self-perception. This work requires what we might call radical self-observation, the willingness to catch ourselves in the act of self-criticism and pause long enough to ask, whose voice is this really? What wound is speaking? What old pain is being triggered? It requires the development of an inner witness, capable of observing our internal processes with compassion rather than judgment, curiosity rather than condemnation. The process of healing these primal wounds is not about forgiveness in the conventional sense, not about excusing those who hurt us, or pretending that the damage was not real. It is about recognizing that the people who wounded us were themselves wounded, that they gave us what they had been given, that they could not provide what they had never received. This understanding does not excuse their failures, but it does free us from the burden of taking their limitations personally. More importantly, healing involves developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites within our own psyche. We learn to hold both the reality of the wounds we received and the possibility of healing them ourselves. We learn to carry both the grief of what we did not receive and the hope of what we can still create for ourselves. We learn to honor both the child within who was hurt and the adult we have become who has the power to provide what was missing. This is perhaps the most sacred work we can undertake, becoming the parent to ourselves that we needed but never had. It means learning to offer ourselves the unconditional positive regard we never received, to see ourselves with the eyes of love rather than criticism, to accept our authentic nature rather than demanding that we be someone else to earn our own approval. The mother wound heals when we learn to nurture ourselves with the tenderness we craved, when we learn to see our sensitivity as a gift rather than a flaw, when we learn to trust our own needs and honor them without apology. We become the mother to ourselves, who delights in our authentic expression, who sees our struggles with compassion rather than criticism, who celebrates our uniqueness rather than trying to correct it. The father wound heals when we learn to validate our own efforts, when we learn to approve of ourselves, regardless of external achievement, when we learn to trust our own inner authority, rather than seeking permission from others to be who we are. We become the father to ourselves, who cheers us on rather than judges us, who accepts our humanity rather than demanding perfection, who offers protection rather than criticism. This internal reparenting is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice, a daily choice to treat ourselves with the love and acceptance we deserved from the beginning. It means catching ourselves when we slip into old patterns of self-criticism and gently redirecting our attention toward self-compassion. It means learning to comfort ourselves in disappointment, celebrate ourselves in success, and hold ourselves with tenderness through all the ordinary struggles of human life. The work of healing these ancient wounds requires us to develop new neural pathways of self-relation, to literally rewire our brains for self-love rather than self-criticism. This happens through repetition, through repeatedly choosing the loving voice over the critical voice, the compassionate response over the harsh judgment, the accepting stance over the demanding expectation. We must learn to become bilingual in the language of love, fluent not only in the criticism and judgment that came so naturally after years of practice, but also in the foreign tongue of self-acceptance, self-compassion, self-celebration. At first, this new language feels awkward, unfamiliar, even false. But with practice, it becomes as natural as breathing, as automatic as the criticism once was. The healing journey also requires us to grieve, to mourn what we never received, to feel the full depth of the abandonment we experienced, to honor the pain of the child within who deserved so much more than they got. This grief is not self-pity but recognition, not wallowing but washing clean. It is the necessary passage through the pain in order to reach the other side, where healing waits. In this grieving, we often discover that our parents' inability to love us fully was not about our unworthiness, but about their own wounds. their own limitations, their own unhealed trauma. We begin to see them not as gods who failed us, but as flawed human beings, doing their best with the tools they had been given, tools that were often broken or insufficient for the task at hand. This perspective does not minimize the impact of their failures on our development, but it does free us from the burden of taking their limitations as evidence of our fundamental flaw. We begin to understand that their criticism said more about their own internal state than about our actual worth, that their inability to see us clearly was more about their own vision than about our visibility. The ultimate healing of these wounds comes not through becoming perfect enough to finally earn the love we always craved, but through recognizing that the love we sought outside ourselves has been available within ourselves all along. We discover that the acceptance we begged for from others is something we can offer ourselves completely and unconditionally. We learn that the validation we sought from external authorities can be generated from within our own depths. This is not spiritual bypassing or positive thinking, but a mature recognition of our own psychological sovereignty. The understanding that while we cannot control how others see us or treat us, we have absolute authority over how we see and treat ourselves. We learn that the most important relationship we will ever have is the relationship we have with ourselves, and that this relationship can be one of love rather than criticism, acceptance rather than judgment, celebration rather than correction. In healing these primal wounds, we do more than free ourselves from the pain of the past. We interrupt the intergenerational transmission of trauma. We break the chain that would have passed these wounds onto our children, our students, our partners, everyone we touch with our lives. We become the ancestors our future selves will thank us for being, the ones who chose to heal rather than to harm, to love rather than to criticize, to accept rather than to reject. The child within us who was wounded by those who could not love us completely finally receives the love they always deserved, not from those who failed to provide it originally, but from the adult we have become who has learned to love without condition, to see without distortion, to accept without reservation. In this offering of love to ourselves, the wound begins to heal, the critical voice begins to soften, and the authentic self, long buried beneath layers of adaptation and performance, begins to emerge into the light of our own acceptance. And in this emergence, we discover something remarkable. We are not only worthy of love exactly as we are love itself, temporarily forgetting its own nature, gradually remembering its own truth. The healing of these ancient wounds is not just personal transformation, but cosmic restoration. The return of love to love, the remembering of what was never actually lost, but only temporarily obscured by the grief of forgetting who we have always been. There comes a moment in every life when the familiar ground beneath our feet begins to crack and crumble, when the carefully constructed edifice of who we thought we were starts to dissolve like morning mist before an unforgiving sun. This is not a failure of will or a weakness of character. It is the soul's ancient call to descent, the psyche's inevitable invitation to journey into the underworld of our own being. Like Inanna, the Sumerian goddess who willingly walked through the 7 gates of the underworld, surrendering her crown, her scepter, her royal garments piece by piece until she stood naked and vulnerable before the throne of her dark sister Ereshkigal. We too must strip away the false vestments of identity that have both protected and imprisoned us. The descent begins not with fanfare or ceremony, but with a whisper in the darkness of sleepless nights, a hollow ache that no amount of external achievement can fill. It announces itself in the sudden inability to find meaning in activities that once brought satisfaction, in the growing sense that we have been living someone else's life, while our own authentic self has been waiting, patient and forgotten, in the shadows of our unconscious. This is what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the first and most terrifying phase of transformation, where everything that seems solid and reliable begins to dissolve into primordial chaos. Jung understood that this descent is not pathological but necessary, not a sign of breakdown but of breakthrough waiting to unfold. The ego, with its defensive strategies and its desperate need to maintain control, recoils from this journey into the unknown. It offers bargains and compromises, promising that surely we can heal and transform while remaining safely on the surface, while keeping our personas intact, while maintaining the illusion that we can change without truly changing. But the psyche knows better. The authentic self cannot be accessed through the ego's defensive maneuvers any more than a butterfly can emerge from its chrysalis without the complete dissolution of its caterpillar form. In the mythology of many cultures, the descent into the underworld is portrayed as a journey that strips away everything non-essential until only the core essence remains. Persephone must be abducted from her mother's protective embrace and dragged into Hades before she can claim her power as queen of the underworld. Orpheus must venture into the realm of death to retrieve his beloved Eurydice, but only by looking forward, never backward, can he hope to bring her back to the light. Christ must descend into hell before his resurrection. These are not merely stories, but psychological maps, archetypal patterns that illuminate the necessary stages of inner transformation. As we begin our own descent, we quickly discover that the underworld of the psyche is populated not by monsters, but by the discarded aspects of ourselves, the parts we abandoned in childhood when we learned they were unacceptable, the dreams we sacrificed on the altar of others' expectations, the authentic impulses we learned to suppress in order to earn love and belonging. These forgotten fragments of the self wait in the darkness like children who have been sent to their rooms and never called back down for dinner. They have not disappeared. They have simply been relegated to the unconscious, where they continue to influence our lives in ways we neither recognize nor understand. The journey into this inner underworld requires a courage that is different from the heroic bravado celebrated by our culture. It is not the courage of conquest, but of surrender, not the strength to overcome, but the willingness to be undone. It asks us to release our death grip on who we think we should be and to meet with radical honesty who we actually are beneath the layers of conditioning and compromise. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the individuation process, that we must lose ourselves in order to find ourselves, that we must die to who we have been in order to be born into who we truly are. The descent often begins with what feels like a crisis of meaning, a sudden inability to continue playing the roles that have defined us. The successful professional finds themselves inexplicably exhausted by achievements that once energized them. The devoted caregiver discovers that their well of compassion has run dry, leaving them resentful and depleted. The people pleaser realizes with horror that they no longer know what they actually want, having spent so many years defining themselves in relation to others' needs and expectations that their own authentic desires have become foreign territory. This crisis is not a mistake to be quickly corrected, but a doorway to be entered with reverence and attention. It signals that the psyche is ready to reclaim the aspects of itself that have been split off and denied, to integrate the shadow material that has been accumulating in the unconscious, like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed. The ego experiences this as threat and catastrophe, but the self, that greater center of personality that Jung identified as our truest essence, recognizes it as homecoming. As we descend deeper into this inner landscape, we encounter not only our personal shadow, but what Jung called the collective unconscious, the inherited patterns and archetypal energies that connect us to the broader human experience. Here we meet the universal themes of abandonment and betrayal, of love and loss, of death and rebirth. We discover that our individual pain is held within larger containers of meaning, that our personal wounds are entry points into the collective human story of suffering and transformation. The underworld reveals itself to be not a place of punishment, but of incubation, not a realm of darkness that we must escape, but a sacred space of gestation where new life is conceived and nurtured, like seeds that must be buried in the dark earth before they can sprout, like the butterfly that must dissolve completely in the chrysalis before it can emerge with wings. We too must undergo this process of psychological death and rebirth if we are to access our full human potential. In this phase of the journey, everything that seemed certain becomes questionable. The values we inherited from our families of origin, the beliefs we absorbed from our culture, the identities we constructed to navigate the world, all of these begin to loosen their hold on us. This can be deeply disorienting, like losing our bearings in a familiar neighborhood that suddenly looks strange and foreign. The ego panics at this dissolution of its carefully constructed world, but the soul recognizes it as the necessary prelude to authentic self-discovery. The descent into the underworld of the psyche is ultimately a journey toward wholeness, but it requires us to embrace the parts of ourselves that we have spent our lives trying to escape or improve. It asks us to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposing forces within ourselves without immediately rushing to resolve the contradiction. We learn to sit with paradox, to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, to trust that meaning will emerge from the chaos if we can resist the premature urge to impose order upon it. Here in the depths, we begin to understand that the very qualities we have rejected in ourselves often contain the seeds of our greatest gifts. The sensitivity we learn to see as weakness may hold our capacity for deep empathy and artistic expression. The anger we were taught to suppress may contain our passion for justice and our ability to set healthy boundaries. The sadness we have tried to avoid may be the gateway to our capacity for profound love and connection. The underworld teaches us that nothing is wasted, that every aspect of our human experience has its place in the larger tapestry of our becoming. The transformation that occurs in this deep place is not a matter of self-improvement or positive thinking, but of fundamental reorganization at the level of being. It is what the mystics have called the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness and apparent abandonment that precedes genuine spiritual breakthrough. Jung understood this as the necessary prelude to individuation, the process by which we become who we truly are rather than who we think we should be. As we journey deeper into this inner underworld, we may encounter what feels like the complete breakdown of our previous way of being in the world. This is the negredo at its most intense, the phase of the alchemical work where everything is reduced to its essential components, where the false structures of personality are dissolved in the acid bath of self-confrontation. It is here that we meet not the idealized version of ourselves that we have been trying to become, but the raw material of our humanity in all its messy, contradictory, beautiful complexity. The wisdom of the underworld is not gentle or comforting in the way that our egos might prefer. It is the fierce wisdom of transformation, the relentless truth that emerges when we can no longer hide from ourselves behind the veils of projection and defense. It reveals to us not only who we have been, but who we have the potential to become when we stop running from our own depths and learn to embrace the fullness of our human experience. In this sacred darkness, we begin to understand that the journey into the underworld is not about escaping the human condition, but about embracing it more fully. We discover that our wounds are not obstacles to our wholeness, but pathways toward it, that our scars are not signs of our brokenness, but evidence of our capacity to heal and grow. The underworld teaches us that we are not here to transcend our humanity, but to embody it more authentically, to become fully human rather than trying to be superhuman. The descent continues deeper and deeper into the forgotten corners of our being, where all the unloved and unwanted aspects of ourselves wait with infinite patience for our return. And in this journey into the depths, we begin to glimpse the profound truth that Jung spent his lifetime exploring, that within the darkness of our own unconscious lies not the enemy of our becoming, but its very source and ground. In the deepest caverns of the psyche, where the light of consciousness has never penetrated, dwells a figure that most of us would rather never meet, the shadow of the unloved self. This is not the glamorous shadow that Jung wrote about in his more accessible works, not the repressed creative potential or the untapped masculine or feminine energy waiting to be integrated. This is the raw, wounded, primal shadow, the one who carries within their being every moment of rejection we have ever experienced, every instance of abandonment that taught us we were not enough, every subtle and not so subtle message that our authentic self was somehow wrong, too much, or fundamentally unacceptable. Here, in the underground chambers of our unconscious, lives the child who learned that love was conditional, that acceptance required the sacrifice of authenticity, that survival meant becoming someone other than who we naturally were. This shadow figure has been collecting evidence for decades, a catalog of every time we were overlooked, dismissed, criticized, or made to feel that our natural impulses were inappropriate. They hold the fury of every boundary we failed to set, the grief of every dream we abandoned to please others, the rage of every moment we betrayed our own truth in the desperate hope of earning love and belonging. The unloved self is not merely a concept or psychological construct. It is a living presence within us, a part of our psyche that has been split off and relegated to the darkness because its pain was too intense for our conscious mind to bear. Jung understood that what we cannot face consciously does not disappear but continues to operate from the shadows, influencing our choices, sabotaging our relationships, and ensuring that we recreate the very patterns of abandonment and rejection that wounded us in the first place. The unloved self becomes the inner critic that whispers we are not good enough, the self-saboteur that undermines our success just as it begins to flourish, the people-pleaser that cannot tolerate the thought of anyone's disapproval. Meeting this shadow requires a courage that goes beyond anything our culture typically recognizes or celebrates. It is not the heroic courage of conquest, but the vulnerable courage of witness, the willingness to turn toward our own pain with the same compassion we would offer a suffering child. For that is exactly what the unloved self is, the wounded child aspect of our psyche that has been carrying our pain in isolation, waiting for someone to finally see them, acknowledge their suffering, and offer them the love they have always deserved but never received. The initial encounter with this shadow figure is rarely gentle or comfortable. After years or decades of being ignored, dismissed, or actively suppressed, the unloved self does not greet us with gratitude for our belated attention. Instead, they often meet us with the full force of their accumulated rage and grief. They may lash out with accusations. Where were you when I needed you? How could you abandon me for so long? How could you choose everyone else's comfort over my very existence? This rage is not pathological or inappropriate. It is the healthy anger of a being who has been neglected and betrayed even by ourselves. Jung recognized that this shadow anger serves a vital function in the individuation process. It is the psyche's way of reclaiming its own integrity, of refusing to continue the pattern of self-abandonment that has characterized so much of our lives. The unloved self's fury is not something to be managed or overcome, but something to be witnessed and honored as the appropriate response to a lifetime of emotional neglect. Their anger points us toward the truth of our own worth, toward the recognition that we deserved better treatment, not just from others, but from ourselves. As we learn to sit with this shadow figure, without immediately trying to fix, improve, or soothe them, we begin to discover the profound wisdom that lies within their darkness. The unloved self has been the keeper of our authenticity, the guardian of the parts of us that refuse to be completely domesticated by social conditioning. While our conscious self was learning to be agreeable and acceptable, the unloved self was preserving our wildness, our passion, our capacity for righteous anger and appropriate boundaries. They have been holding space for all the aspects of our humanity that didn't fit into the narrow definition of acceptability we internalized as children. The unloved self carries not only our wounds, but our greatest strengths, the very qualities that we learned to hide because they made others uncomfortable. Our sensitivity, which was labeled as too much, holds our capacity for deep empathy and intuitive understanding. Our anger, which was deemed inappropriate, contains our passion for justice and our ability to protect what we love. Our sadness, which others couldn't tolerate, carries our capacity for profound connection and authentic emotion. Our neediness, which was seen as weakness, reflects our natural human desire for love and belonging. The process of shadow integration is not about eliminating these aspects of ourselves, but about learning to relate to them consciously and compassionately. It requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between our conscious persona and our unconscious shadow without collapsing into identification with either side. We learn to acknowledge the unloved self's pain without drowning in it, to honor their anger without being consumed by it, to validate their needs without losing ourselves in neediness. This integration work is profoundly challenging because it requires us to feel, often for the first time, the full impact of our own abandonment and rejection. The unloved self has been serving as a repository for all the pain we couldn't afford to feel when we were young and dependent on others for survival. Now, as adults with greater resources and capacity, we can finally turn toward this pain with presence and compassion. But this means experiencing the grief we have been avoiding, feeling the anger we have been suppressing, acknowledging the depth of our unmet needs for love and acceptance. The healing that occurs when we finally embrace the unloved self is not a matter of providing them with the love they were denied, though self-compassion is certainly part of the process. The deepest healing comes from the recognition that this shadow figure has always been worthy of love, that their pain is evidence not of their inadequacy, but of their profound capacity for feeling and connection. The unloved self begins to transform not when we try to fix their wounds, but when we simply witness them with unconditional acceptance, when we finally see them as they truly are, not a problem to be solved, but a part of ourselves to be welcomed home. As we develop this relationship with our shadow self, we begin to notice profound shifts in how we move through the world. The desperate need to please others begins to diminish as we learn to meet our own needs for validation and acceptance. The fear of rejection loses its power over us as we stop rejecting ourselves. The patterns of self-abandonment that have characterized our relationships begin to dissolve as we refuse to abandon ourselves for the comfort of others. The unloved self, once integrated, becomes a powerful ally in our journey toward wholeness. They become the inner guardian who alerts us when we are betraying ourselves, the fierce protector who helps us maintain healthy boundaries, the authentic voice that refuses to let us disappear into roles and personas that don't serve our true nature. What once felt like our greatest weakness, our capacity to be hurt, our need for love, our sensitivity to rejection, reveals itself to be the source of our greatest strength and most profound gifts. Jung understood that this shadow work is not a one-time event, but an ongoing relationship that deepens and evolves throughout our lives. The unloved self continues to reveal new layers of wounding and wisdom, new areas where we have abandoned ourselves that require attention and integration. But once we have established this compassionate relationship with our shadow, once we have learned to turn toward our pain rather than away from it, the process becomes less frightening and more sacred, an ongoing dialogue with the deepest parts of ourselves. The transformation that occurs through shadow integration is not cosmetic or superficial. It is a fundamental reorganization of how we relate to ourselves and others. We no longer need to earn love through performance or people-pleasing because we have learned to offer ourselves the unconditional acceptance we always craved. We no longer fear our own intensity or emotional depth because we have embraced these qualities as gifts rather than liabilities. We no longer abandon ourselves in relationships because we have committed to remaining present to our own experience, even when others are uncomfortable with our authenticity. In the alchemical tradition, this phase of the work was known as the albedo, the whitening that follows the nigredo, the emergence of clarity and integration after the chaos of dissolution. The unloved self, once hidden in shadow and shame, begins to reveal itself as a source of wisdom and strength. Their wounds become wisdom, their anger becomes appropriate boundaries, their sadness becomes compassion, their neediness becomes healthy interdependence. The meeting with the shadow of the unloved self is ultimately an encounter with our own wholeness, not the perfected wholeness of spiritual bypassing, but the messy, complicated, beautiful wholeness of full humanity. It is here, in the darkness of our own rejected aspects, that we discover not the monster we feared, but the abandoned child who holds the key to our own healing, our own authenticity, our own capacity for genuine love and connection. As we continue this sacred work of integration, we begin to understand that the unloved self was never our enemy, but our greatest teacher, never our weakness, but our hidden strength, never the problem to be solved, but the solution we had been seeking all along. In embracing this shadow figure with compassion and presence, we finally come home to ourselves, not as we think we should be, but as we truly are in all our wounded, wise, and wonderful complexity. Chapter 8. The Alchemical Fire of Conscious Suffering. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when choosing oneself ignites an alchemical fire so profound, so transformative, that everything false within us begins to burn. This is not the wild, destructive flame of unconscious rage or the smoldering ember of repressed resentment. This is the sacred fire of conscious suffering, the divine flame that medieval alchemists knew could transmute lead into gold, that Jung recognized as the heat necessary to separate the pure from the impure within the human psyche. When you first make the radical decision to honor your authentic self over the comfortable prison of people-pleasing, you strike the match that will set your entire inner world ablaze. The spark catches not on what is real within you, but on what has been constructed, layer upon layer of adaptive strategies, masks worn so long they have fused with skin, identities built from the expectations of others rather than the truth of your being. The fire feeds hungrily on these false structures, and in the beginning, the burning feels like annihilation. This is the paradox that Jung understood so deeply. The very act of choosing authenticity initiates a kind of death. Not the death of the body, but the death of everything you thought you were. The people-pleasing self, that carefully constructed persona that has navigated relationships and social expectations with such exhausting precision, suddenly finds itself in flames. The accommodating smile that never quite reached your eyes begins to melt. The automatic yes that leaped from your lips before your true desires could even form a whisper starts to dissolve. The elaborate internal mechanisms that constantly calculated what others needed from you begin to break down under the heat of your emerging authenticity. But here is where conscious suffering reveals its sacred nature. Unlike the unconscious pain of self-abandonment, that dull, persistent ache of living disconnected from your truth, this fire serves a holy purpose. It does not burn to punish. It burns to purify. It does not destroy to create emptiness. It destroys to make space for what has always been, waiting to emerge from beneath the accumulated sediment of compromise and adaptation. Jung called this process the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, recognizing that individuation requires us to go against our natural tendency toward unconsciousness, our instinct to remain safely embedded in the collective's expectations. The fire of conscious suffering is the heat that makes this work possible. Each moment you choose your truth over external approval, each time you honor your authentic needs rather than the comfort of others, each decision to speak from your soul rather than from the carefully rehearsed script of acceptability, these choices become fuel for the transformative flame. The ego, that part of consciousness that has identified so completely with the people-pleasing role, experiences this burning as a kind of torture. It writhes and protests, offering negotiations and compromises. Perhaps we could be authentic just sometimes, it suggests desperately. Maybe we could honor our truth only when it doesn't inconvenience others. But the fire of individuation is not interested in partial measures. It demands complete surrender, the full offering of everything false upon its altar, and so the burning deepens. The elaborate fantasy of being loved for your accommodations begins to smoke and char. The belief that your worth depends on others' comfort starts to crackle and hiss. The unconscious contract you signed long ago, agreeing to abandon yourself in exchange for acceptance, curls at the edges and turns to ash. With each layer that burns away, the fire reveals something that was always there, waiting beneath the accumulated debris of adaptation, the gold of your authentic being. This is not new gold, freshly minted by the fire. This is ancient gold, the eternal essence of who you have always been, now revealed as the false has been consumed. Jung understood that individuation does not create the self. It uncovers the self that has been obscured by the persona's elaborate costume. The fire does not make you whole. It burns away everything that has hidden your inherent wholeness from your own perception. But the process is not gentle. Conscious suffering earns its name through the excruciating awareness that accompanies each moment of the burning. This is not unconscious transformation happening in the safe darkness of unawareness. This is conscious participation in your own destruction and reconstruction, watching with full attention as everything you thought defined you crumbles in the flames. You feel every false identity as it burns. You witness every adaptive strategy as it turns to smoke. You experience the death of every people-pleasing mechanism with vivid, sometimes overwhelming clarity. The fire feeds on your attachments to external validation. Each time you have compromised your truth to maintain someone else's comfort, that compromise becomes tinder. Every moment you have silenced your authentic voice to preserve someone else's approval, that silencing becomes kindling. All the ways you have contorted yourself to fit into others' expectations, all the times you have denied your own needs to avoid disappointing another. These betrayals of self become the very fuel that powers your transformation. And the fire is relentless. It burns not just in moments of dramatic choice, but in the 1,000 small decisions that make up a life lived authentically. It burns when you feel the impulse to apologize for taking up space and choose instead to stand in your worth. It burns when the familiar anxiety of disappointing others rises in your throat and you breathe through it rather than immediately capitulating. It burns in the silence between someone's request and your response, in that sacred pause where you actually feel into what you truly want before answering. The flames are fed by truth-telling. Each time you risk sharing your authentic thoughts, instead of the sanitized version you think others want to hear, the fire grows stronger. Every moment you allow your real feelings to be visible instead of hiding behind the mask of perpetual agreeability, the burning intensifies. When you finally speak your boundaries clearly, instead of hoping others will magically intuit them, the fire roars with satisfaction, consuming another layer of false accommodation. Jung recognized that this alchemical fire operates according to the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme position to transform into its opposite. The more completely you have identified with the people-pleasing persona, the more intensely the fire burns when you finally choose authenticity. The deeper your history of self-abandonment, the more profound the purification required. The fire burns in direct proportion to what needs to be transformed, calibrating itself to the exact degree of heat necessary for your particular brand of lead to become gold. But here is what the ego cannot understand as it rises in the flames. This burning is not happening to you, it is happening as you. You are not the victim of this fire, you are the alchemist who lit it. The conscious suffering is not punishment for your past people-pleasing. It is the necessary condition for your liberation from it. Jung understood that what we call suffering is often simply the psyche's resistance to its own healing, the ego's protest against the very transformation it secretly longs for. The fire burns away your need for constant external validation, revealing the steady flame of self-approval that has always burned within. It consumes your terror of disappointing others, uncovering your profound capacity to disappoint with love rather than cruelty. It destroys your unconscious belief that your worth is earned through service to others' comfort, revealing your inherent worthiness that requires no external proof or validation. As the burning continues, something extraordinary begins to happen. The pain that initially felt unbearable starts to reveal itself as sensation rather than suffering. The heat that once seemed destructive reveals itself as creative force. The fire that appeared to be consuming your identity reveals itself to be consuming only what was never truly you in the first place. What emerges from the flames is not a diminished version of who you were, but a purified essence of who you have always been. The gold that the fire reveals is not soft or malleable like the lead that has been burned away. This gold is resilient, refined by heat into something that cannot be easily bent or broken by others' expectations. It gleams with the particular radiance that comes only from authenticity tested in the fire of conscious choice. It carries the wisdom that can only be earned through the direct experience of choosing self-love over self-abandonment again and again until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing. Jung taught us that this fire of conscious suffering is ultimately a fire of love, love so fierce and uncompromising that it will not allow us to remain in the comfortable prison of our people-pleasing patterns. It is love that burns away everything that keeps us from recognizing our own worth. It is love that consumes every false identity that prevents us from knowing our authentic self. It is love that refuses to let us settle for the pale imitation of life that comes from constant self-betrayal. And as the fire does its work, as layer after layer of false identity burns away, what remains is not the person others needed you to be, but the person you were always meant to become. The fire reveals that beneath all your adaptations and accommodations, beneath all your careful calculations of others' needs and expectations, there has always existed a self of such beauty, such wholeness, such authentic power that no external validation could ever add to its worth or diminish its radiance. This is the alchemical miracle that conscious suffering makes possible, the transformation of the base metal of self-abandonment into the pure gold of self-love. Not the narcissistic fool's gold of ego inflation, but the genuine article, self-love that includes others in its embrace precisely because it no longer excludes the self, self-care that serves the whole because it no longer sacrifices the individual, authenticity that enhances relationships because it brings truth instead of pretense to every encounter. The fire burns until only gold remains, and in that gold, refined by the heat of conscious choosing, you finally recognize not a new person, but the person who was always there, waiting patiently beneath the accumulated layers of compromise, ready to shine with the particular radiance that belongs to you alone. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, not the creation of something new, but the discovery of something eternal, revealed at last by the sacred fire of choosing to be uncompromisingly and authentically yourself. Chapter 9. The Death and Rebirth of the Pleasing Self. In the deepest chamber of the soul's transformation lies a death so profound, so complete, that it feels like the end of existence itself. This is not the gentle fading of old habits or the gradual shift of perspective. This is the sacred death of the people-pleasing self, that elaborate, carefully constructed identity that has served as your primary face to the world for so long that its dissolution threatens the very foundation of who you believe yourself to be. Jung understood that at the heart of individuation lies this necessary death, this symbolic crucifixion of the false self that must occur before the authentic self can be resurrected. But knowing this intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are two entirely different territories of human existence. When the moment of ego death arrives, when the people-pleasing persona finally begins its inevitable dissolution, the experience is nothing short of apocalyptic for the consciousness that is identified so completely with this adaptive mask. The death begins not with a single dramatic moment, but with 1,000 small betrayals of the old self. Each time you choose authenticity over approval, you drive another nail into the coffin of who you used to be. Each boundary you speak clearly instead of hoping others will guess, each no that emerges from your lips, where once only yes lived, each moment you refuse to apologize for taking up space. These choices accumulate like snowflakes, seemingly insignificant individually, but together creating an avalanche that buries the people-pleasing self beneath the weight of your emerging authenticity. At first, the dying self fights desperately for its survival. It whispers seductively about the safety of the old ways, the comfort of being needed, the terrible risks of authenticity. But what if they leave you, it pleads? What if you become selfish, demanding, unlikable? What if your worth really was tied to your usefulness to others? These voices rise from the dying identity like the last gasps of a drowning person, grasping frantically for anything that might postpone the inevitable submersion into the waters of transformation. The terror is real and overwhelming because, for so long, the people-pleasing self has been more than just a strategy. It has been your entire identity. You have known yourself primarily through the mirror of others' approval, defined your worth through their comfort, measured your value through their satisfaction. The thought of existing without these external references feels like trying to navigate in complete darkness without any familiar landmarks. Who will you be if not the person who anticipates everyone's needs? How will you know your worth if not through others' gratitude? What will fill the space where the constant vigilance for others' moods once lived? Jung recognized that this terror of dissolution is actually the ego's fear of its own transformation. The part of consciousness that has identified with the people-pleasing role cannot imagine existence beyond this identity, just as a caterpillar cannot conceive of flight while still bound by the limitations of its earthbound form. The ego experiences the death of the false self as its own annihilation, unable to perceive that what is dying is not the true self, but merely the costume the true self has worn for protection. And so the death deepens, layer by layer, identity by identity. The automatic smile that has served as your default expression begins to feel foreign on your face. The elaborate internal calculations that once determined every response. What do they need to hear? How can I make this easier for them? What will keep everyone comfortable? These mechanisms start to malfunction, their gears grinding to a halt as a new voice begins to whisper from deep within. But what do you need? What do you want? What feels true for you? This new voice is terrifying in its unfamiliarity. For so long, your own needs have been background noise, easily overridden by the louder demands of others' comfort. Your authentic desires have been so thoroughly suppressed that their emergence feels like the voice of a stranger speaking a language you have forgotten how to understand. The people-pleasing self recoils from this inner voice, recognizing it as the harbinger of its own demise. The death accelerates when you begin to experience the profound loneliness that has been your constant companion, carefully hidden beneath the busyness of tending to everyone else's needs. As the people-pleasing mechanisms break down, the silence they have been covering becomes audible. You realize that all your elaborate accommodations, all your careful management of others' emotions, all your tireless service to their comfort, none of it has created the deep connection you secretly craved. Instead, it has created a kind of intimate isolation, surrounded by people who love your performance but have never met your authentic self. This recognition brings a grief so profound that it threatens to drown you in its depths. You mourn not just for the time lost to inauthenticity, but for the connections that were never truly made, the love that was conditional on your accommodation, the relationships that existed only as long as you continued to betray yourself for others' comfort. You grieve for the child within you, who learned so early that love must be earned through self-sacrifice, that worth must be proven through usefulness, that acceptance requires the perpetual abandonment of authentic need. But Jung taught us that this grief, this profound mourning for the false self, is the necessary preparation for rebirth. The tears that fall as the people-pleasing identity dies are not just tears of loss, but tears of preparation, watering the ground from which the authentic self will grow. The composting of the old identity creates the rich soil necessary for new growth, transforming what was once alive but false into nutrients for what is true but not yet fully born. In the depths of this death, something extraordinary begins to occur. In the space created by the dissolution of the people-pleasing self, in the silence left behind when the constant internal chatter about others' needs finally quiets, a new presence begins to stir. At first, it is so subtle you might miss it, a whisper of genuine desire beneath the rubble of abandoned accommodations, a flicker of authentic preference in the darkness of dissolved adaptations. This emerging presence does not arrive with fanfare or dramatic revelation. It comes quietly, tentatively, like a wild animal approaching a clearing where it has been hunted before. Your authentic self has been in exile for so long that it approaches cautiously, unsure whether it is truly safe to emerge, whether this death of the false self is genuine or merely another elaborate performance designed to earn approval. The rebirth begins in the smallest ways, a moment of genuine preference acknowledged without apology, a feeling honored without judgment, a need expressed without elaborate justification, a boundary spoken clearly without cushioning it in excessive explanations. These tiny acts of authenticity are like the first green shoots pushing through the composted remains of what you used to be, delicate but persistent, fragile but determined to grow. Jung understood that this rebirth follows the ancient pattern of death and resurrection that runs through all of mythology and religion. The authentic self that emerges from the death of the people-pleasing persona is both entirely new and utterly ancient, new in its freedom from adaptive constraints, ancient in its connection to the eternal patterns of wholeness that have always existed within the psyche. You are being born into who you have always been, freed at last from the elaborate costume of who others needed you to be. But the process is not linear or predictable. Just as a physical birth involves contractions, periods of intense pressure followed by moments of rest, the psychological rebirth involves its own rhythm of emergence and retreat. There are times when the authentic self feels strong and clear, when your truth flows naturally and your boundaries feel as solid as mountains. And there are times when the old patterns reassert themselves, when the people-pleasing mechanisms spring back to life like muscle memory, when the terror of authenticity drives you temporarily back toward the familiar prison of accommodation. This back and forth is not a sign of failure, but of the natural rhythm of transformation. The snake does not shed its skin in a single moment, but through a gradual process of loosening and release. Similarly, the death of the people-pleasing self and the birth of the authentic self occur through cycles of letting go and emerging, dissolution and formation, death and rebirth played out in an infinite series of small moments and choices. What makes this process particularly disorienting is that you are simultaneously experiencing the grief of ending and the excitement of beginning, the terror of the unknown and the relief of finally being true, the death of who you have been and the birth of who you are meant to be. Jung called this the holding of opposites, the capacity to contain contradictory experiences without rushing to resolve them into simple, comfortable conclusions. The dying self mourns its own passing, even as it recognizes the necessity of its death. Part of you grieves for the simplicity of the old ways, the clear role of the accommodation, the predictable rhythms of self-betrayal. There was a certain comfort in always knowing what others needed from you, even if meeting those needs required the constant sacrifice of your own truth. There was a kind of safety in the familiar prison of people-pleasing, even if that safety came at the cost of authenticity. Meanwhile, the emerging self celebrates each moment of genuine expression, each boundary spoken clearly, each choice made from authentic desire rather than adaptive calculation. This part of you feels like it is finally coming home after a long exile, recognizing in authenticity something that feels more familiar than the familiar, more natural than the patterns you have practiced for years. The rebirth accelerates when you begin to experience authentic connection for the first time, not the pseudo-intimacy created by constant accommodation, but the real intimacy that becomes possible when you finally bring your truth to relationship. When someone loves you not for your usefulness, but for your authenticity, not for your accommodation, but for your honesty, not for your service, but for your presence. This experience is so profound, so healing, that it validates every moment of the difficult death you have endured. You discover that authenticity, far from making you selfish or demanding actually makes you more genuinely caring. When you are no longer depleted by constant self-betrayal, when you are no longer resentful from endless accommodation, you find that you have more genuine love to offer. Love that flows from abundance rather than depletion. Care that comes from choice rather than compulsion. Service that emerges from joy rather than duty. The person being born from the ashes of the people-pleasing self is not harder or colder or more selfish than who you used to be. They are more real, more present, more genuinely loving because their love now includes themselves in its embrace. They care for others not from the desperate need to earn worth through service, but from the genuine desire to contribute to the well-being of people they authentically cherish. Jung taught that this rebirth creates what he called the transcendent function, a new capacity to hold both care for others and care for self, both generosity and boundaries, both giving and receiving. The reborn self does not swing from people-pleasing to people-repelling, from accommodation to aggression, from self-betrayal to selfishness. Instead, it finds the sacred middle way, the place where authentic self-care enables genuine other care, where clear boundaries create space for deeper intimacy, where honoring your own truth allows you to meet others in theirs. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this death and rebirth is the recognition that what you thought was dying was never truly alive in the first place. The people-pleasing self was not your authentic identity, but an elaborate survival mechanism, a psychological armor worn so long that you forgot you were wearing it. What felt like the death of everything you were reveals itself to be the shedding of everything you were not, making space for everything you have always been, but never had permission to express. In the end, the death of the people-pleasing self is not a tragedy, but a liberation. It is not the end of love, but the beginning of genuine love. It is not the loss of connection, but the foundation for authentic relationship. It is not the death of caring, but the birth of caring that includes the self as worthy of care. From the compost of who you used to be, watered by the tears of necessary grief, and warmed by the sacred fire of conscious choice, emerges a self so authentically beautiful, so genuinely powerful, so naturally loving that you wonder how you ever mistook the people-pleasing costume for your true identity. This is the miracle of psychological rebirth, not the creation of someone new, but the revelation of someone eternal, freed at last to live and love and choose from the unshakable ground of authentic being. The person who emerges from this sacred death is both entirely transformed and utterly themselves, transformed in their relationship to authenticity, themselves in their connection to the eternal patterns of wholeness that were always present, waiting patiently beneath the accumulated layers of adaptation and accommodation, ready to be born when the false finally dies and makes space for the true. Chapter 10. The Integration of the Anima and Animus. Deep within the architecture of the psyche, two ancient forces have been locked in an eternal war, a conflict so fundamental, so pervasive, that it has shaped every choice you have ever made, every boundary you have failed to speak, every moment you have abandoned yourself in service to others' comfort. Jung named these archetypal energies the anima and animus, the feminine principle that knows through feeling and intuition, and the masculine principle that acts with clarity and determination. For those caught in the web of people-pleasing, these forces have become adversaries rather than allies, each judging and undermining the other in ways that make wholeness seem impossible. The anima within you, that deep feminine wisdom that feels into the truth of situations, that knows through the body and heart rather than the mind, has been corrupted by the people-pleasing pattern into a harsh judge of self-care. She whispers seductively about the nobility of sacrifice, the beauty of endless giving, the spiritual superiority of putting everyone else's needs before your own. But this is not the true anima speaking. This is the anima filtered through generations of conditioning that equated feminine worth with self-abnegation, that made love synonymous with self-sacrifice. The authentic anima knows that caring for yourself is not selfish, but sacred, that honoring your own needs creates the foundation from which genuine care for others can flow. She understands that the well must be full before it can nourish the garden, that the lamp must have oil before it can illuminate the darkness. But the corrupted anima has forgotten this ancient wisdom, instead wielding guilt like a weapon against any impulse toward self-care, any moment of honoring your authentic needs. Meanwhile, the animus within you, that clarifying masculine energy that sees truth clearly and acts with decisive purpose, has been equally distorted by the people-pleasing pattern. He judges emotional needs as weakness, dismisses feelings as inconvenient interruptions to the important work of managing everyone else's comfort. In his corrupted form, the animus becomes the harsh internal critic that attacks any display of vulnerability, any acknowledgement of personal limits, any expression of authentic human need. The true animus knows that emotions carry essential information, that vulnerability is a form of courage, that acknowledging your needs is not weakness, but wisdom. But the distorted animus has been trained to see feeling as the enemy of effectiveness, sensitivity as incompatible with strength, emotional honesty as a luxury that people-pleasers cannot afford. And so these two great forces within you have become locked in a destructive dance. The corrupted anima judges every act of self-care as selfishness, while the distorted animus judges every emotional need as weakness. Together they create an internal environment where authenticity becomes impossible, where self-betrayal feels like virtue, where the constant abandonment of your truth seems like the only path to love and acceptance. Jung understood that wholeness, what he called individuation, requires the integration of these opposite forces, the marriage of feminine wisdom and masculine action within the individual psyche. But this is not a simple process of balance or compromise. This is a profound alchemical transformation that transmutes the base metal of internal conflict into the gold of internal harmony, creating an inner partnership where feeling informs action and action honors feeling. The integration begins when you recognize that both voices have been speaking from fear rather than wisdom. The anima's insistence on endless self-sacrifice comes not from genuine love, but from the terror of being seen as selfish. The animus's dismissal of emotional needs comes not from true strength, but from the fear of being perceived as weak. Both have been shaped by a culture that could not hold the paradox of strength and sensitivity, that forced people to choose between caring for others and caring for themselves. As you begin to choose authenticity over approval, something extraordinary starts to happen within the depths of your psyche. The true anima begins to emerge from beneath the layers of conditioning that have distorted her voice. She speaks now not with guilt, but with gentle wisdom, reminding you that self-care is not selfish, but necessary, that honoring your needs creates the foundation for genuine service to others. She knows that the mother who neglects her own nourishment cannot truly nourish her children, that the friend who constantly betrays their own truth cannot offer authentic friendship to others. This authentic anima recognizes that love, which demands the sacrifice of self, is not love but a form of psychological vampirism. She understands that relationships built on one person's constant accommodation are not sustainable, that connections requiring the perpetual abandonment of authenticity are destined to breed resentment rather than intimacy. Her voice carries the ancient wisdom of the feminine, the knowledge that life flourishes when all parts are honored, when the ecosystem of the self is tended with the same care given to any other living system. Simultaneously, the true animus begins to assert himself, not as the harsh critic of emotional reality, but as the clarifying force that can see truth and act upon it with unwavering commitment. He recognizes that boundaries are not walls, but bridges, that saying no to what drains you creates space for saying yes to what nourishes you. This authentic masculine energy knows that protecting your truth is not aggression, but integrity, that standing in your worth is not arrogance, but self-respect. The integrated animus does not dismiss feelings, but acts in service of them. When the anima whispers that a situation feels wrong, the animus investigates with curiosity rather than judgment. When she recognizes that a relationship is built on your constant accommodation rather than mutual respect, he finds the courage to address the imbalance directly. When she feels the exhaustion that comes from endless people-pleasing, he creates the boundaries necessary to restore your energy and authenticity. This is not the animus overriding the anima or the anima manipulating the animus. This is true partnership, each bringing their essential gifts to the shared project of living authentically. The anima provides the wisdom of feeling into what is true, what is nourishing, what serves the highest good of all involved. The animus provides the clarity and courage necessary to act upon this wisdom, even when action requires disappointing others or challenging established patterns. Jung recognized that this integration manifests differently in each individual, but the essential pattern remains constant. Feeling and action learn to work together rather than against each other. Emotional wisdom informs decisive action, while clear boundaries create space for authentic feeling. Self-care becomes not selfish indulgence, but wise stewardship, while service to others flows from abundance rather than depletion. The marriage of anima and animus within your psyche creates what Jung called the transcendent function, a new capacity that transcends the limitations of either pole alone. This integrated consciousness can hold apparent opposites without needing to resolve them into simple conclusions. It can be both strong and gentle, both caring and boundaried, both generous and self-protective. It recognizes that these qualities are not contradictory but complementary, each enabling and enhancing the other. When the anima and animus work together rather than against each other, you discover that you can love others without abandoning yourself, that you can care deeply while maintaining clear boundaries, that you can be generous without being depleted. The internal war that once raged between feeling and action, between care for others and care for self, transforms into an internal partnership that serves both individual authenticity and genuine relationship. This integration manifests in your daily choices in profound ways. When someone makes a request that feels burdensome, both the anima and animus respond together. She feels into whether this request aligns with your values and capacity, while he finds the words to communicate your truth clearly and kindly. When you feel the old impulse to apologize for taking up space, she reminds you of your inherent worth, while he helps you stand in that worth without defensiveness or aggression. The integrated feminine within you no longer equates love with self-sacrifice. She recognizes that genuine love requires the preservation of self as well as care for others, that relationships thrive when both people bring their authentic selves rather than their accommodating personas. This feminine wisdom understands that saying no to what diminishes you allows you to say a fuller yes to what truly serves, that boundaries are expressions of love rather than barriers to it. The integrated masculine within you no longer dismisses emotional reality as inconvenient or weak. He recognizes feelings as essential information about what is and is not working in your life. Emotions as the anima's way of communicating about the health of your choices and relationships. This masculine clarity knows that honoring your emotional truth is not self-indulgence but self-respect, that acting on authentic feelings is not weakness but wisdom. Together they create a new way of being in relationship, both with yourself and with others. You discover that you can express your needs without aggression, set boundaries without cruelty, care for yourself without guilt, and love others without losing yourself. The internal partnership between anima and animus makes possible what the people-pleasing pattern made impossible. Authentic intimacy based on truth rather than accommodation. Jung understood that this integration is not a destination but an ongoing process, a daily choice to honor both feeling and action, both care for self and care for others. The anima and animus must be consciously wedded again and again, in each situation that calls for authentic response, in each moment that requires the marriage of wisdom and courage. The integrated psyche recognizes that self-care is not the opposite of caring for others, but the foundation that makes genuine care possible. When you honor your own needs without guilt, when you express your authentic desires without apology, when you act from love that includes yourself in its embrace, this is not selfishness, but wholeness. This is love expressing itself through the individual rather than despite the individual. This marriage of opposites within your own psyche transforms every relationship in your life. When you no longer need others to validate your worth, you can love them freely rather than desperately. When you no longer require their approval to feel valuable, you can offer authentic support rather than manipulative accommodation. When you no longer abandon yourself to maintain their comfort, you can bring genuine presence rather than anxious performance to every encounter. The anima and animus working in harmony create a form of self-love that is both fierce and gentle, both protective and open. This integrated love refuses to accept treatment that diminishes your authenticity, yet it remains compassionate toward others' struggles and limitations. It sets clear boundaries without building walls, expresses needs without demands, offers care without depletion. In the end, the integration of anima and animus reveals what Jung always knew, that wholeness does not require the sacrifice of any essential part of yourself. The feminine wisdom that knows through feeling and the masculine clarity that acts with purpose are not enemies to be conquered, but allies to be integrated. Their marriage within your psyche creates the internal foundation necessary for external authenticity, the inner harmony that makes possible outer integrity. From this place of integrated wholeness, choosing yourself no longer feels like choosing against others. Instead, it feels like choosing for the highest good of all, recognizing that your authenticity serves not only your own individuation, but the collective healing of a world that has forgotten how to love without self-sacrifice, how to care without self-betrayal, how to give without self-abandonment. The married anima and animus within you become the inner parents you always needed, the nurturing mother who sees your worth as inherent and unearned, and the protective father who stands guard over your authenticity with unwavering commitment. Together they create the inner sanctuary from which all genuine love flows, the psychological ground in which authentic relationship can finally take root and flourish. From the sacred dissolution comes the sacred emergence, not a birth, but a recognition, not a becoming, but an unveiling of what has always lived in the secret chambers of your soul. The authentic self rises like dawn through the mist of old illusions, like truth through the veils of 1,000 compromises, like breath returning to lungs that have held themselves too long in the shallow waters of others' expectations. This is not the self you have constructed through careful performance, not the identity you have assembled from the fragments of approval and the architecture of accommodation. This is the self that existed before you learned to hide, before you discovered that love could be earned through the careful editing of your truth, before you understood that safety might require the slow murder of your own knowing. Jung spoke of this authentic self as the pearl of great price, the philosopher's stone, the treasure difficult to attain, not because it is distant, but because it has been buried beneath layers of protective adaptation so thick that we forget it was ever there. The authentic self emerges not through addition, but through subtraction, not through becoming more, but through being less defended, less performed, less carefully constructed for the comfort of others. It is the self that remains when all the masks have fallen away, when all the costumes have been returned to the theater of social expectation, when all the lines learned for the play of being acceptable have been forgotten in favor of the unrehearsed truth of being alive. This emergence feels simultaneously like remembering and like meeting yourself for the first time, like coming home and like setting foot on foreign soil, like the end of a long exile and the beginning of an adventure you never dared to imagine. Watch how this authentic self carries itself in the world, not with the brittle confidence of those who have learned to perform strength, but with the quiet certainty of those who have made peace with their own ground. It walks neither ahead of itself in anxious anticipation, nor behind itself in regretful reflection, but in the eternal present moment where truth lives and breathes and makes its home in the vessel of conscious being. The authentic self knows its own worth not as something to be proven, but as something to be lived, not as a conclusion reached through external validation, but as a reality discovered in the depths of self-encounter. This is the self that has learned to trust its own internal compass, even when that compass points toward territories unmarked on the maps drawn by collective consensus. It has discovered that its deepest intuitions are more reliable than the loudest voices of social expectation, that its quietest knowing carries more truth than the most confident predictions of those who would shape it to their own comfort. The authentic self operates from what Jung called the self with a capital S, that archetype of wholeness that serves as both the source and the goal of the individuation process, the center that holds when all else is in flux, the still point around which the dance of personality can finally organize itself in harmony rather than conflict. But observe the paradox that Jung understood so deeply. This authentic self that emerges from the chrysalis of dissolved identification is simultaneously the most personal and the most universal aspect of human being. In touching the deepest truth of your individual nature, you touch something that connects you to the deepest truth of all nature. In becoming most fully yourself, you become most fully human. In honoring your own unique constellation of gifts and wounds and possibilities, you honor the creative principle that moves through all life, seeking its own expression through the countless forms of individual existence. The authentic self carries its own approval, like a flame carries its own light, not dependent on external fuel, not diminished by the darkness it encounters, not extinguished by the winds of disapproval that inevitably blow when truth dares to show itself in a world grown comfortable with comfortable lies. This self has learned the difference between the approval that nourishes and the approval that depletes, between the love that expands your capacity to be yourself and the love that requires you to be less than yourself, between the relationships that celebrate your authenticity and the relationships that exist only so long as you agree to remain smaller than your truth. Here begins the great work of integration, not the false integration of spiritual bypassing that pretends all conflicts have been resolved, but the conscious integration that acknowledges the ongoing dance of opposites within the psyche while refusing to be torn apart by their apparent contradictions. The authentic self learns to hold both its need for connection and its need for solitude, both its capacity for love and its requirement for boundaries, both its desire to serve others and its responsibility to serve its own deepest nature. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension creatively rather than collapsing into one side or the other, to find the third way that honors both poles of the paradox, rather than choosing sides in a war that can never be won. This authentic self is vulnerable in a way that the defended self could never risk being vulnerable, not the vulnerability of someone who has been broken by life, but the vulnerability of someone who has been broken open by life, who has discovered that true strength lies not in the capacity to remain unaffected, but in the capacity to be affected and still remain whole. It has learned that openness is not the same as lack of boundaries, that receptivity is not the same as passivity, that gentleness is not the same as weakness. The authentic self can afford to be tender because it has found its own unshakable ground, can afford to be open because it has learned to close when closing is what love requires. Watch how this self navigates the world of relationship, no longer splitting itself between who it is and who it thinks others need it to be, no longer exhausting itself through the constant translation between its inner truth and its outer expression. The authentic self brings the same face to every encounter, speaks the same language in every conversation, operates from the same values in every decision. This does not mean it lacks nuance or sensitivity to context, but rather that its responses arise from a coherent center, rather than from the fragmented impulses of an identity still seeking itself in the mirrors held up by others. The emergence of authentic self requires what Jung understood as a fundamental shift in the locus of authority, from external to internal, from collective to individual, from what others think you should be to what you know yourself to be. This is not the authority of arrogance that needs to prove itself right by making others wrong, but the quiet authority of someone who has done the deep work of self-encounter and emerged with a map of their own territory, a knowledge of their own landscape, a familiarity with their own weather patterns and seasonal cycles and natural rhythms. This authentic self has made peace with its own contradictions, has learned to love the aspects of itself that do not fit neatly into any category, has discovered that wholeness includes the broken places and the rough edges and the parts that will never be acceptable to those who prefer their humans sanitized and simplified for easy consumption. It has learned to see these contradictions not as problems to be solved, but as the creative tension from which all authentic expression arises, the raw material from which a unique contribution to the human experience can be crafted. But notice how this emergence is not a once-and-for-all achievement, but an ongoing process, a daily choice, a moment-by-moment recommitment to truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, being over seeming. The authentic self must be chosen again and again, protected from the constant invitations to return to the safer shores of people-pleasing, defended from the seductive promises of belonging that come with the price tag of betraying your own knowing. Jung understood that individuation is not a destination but a direction, not a state to be achieved, but a way of being to be practiced, not a certificate of completion, but a lifetime enrollment in the school of conscious living. Each day brings new opportunities to choose authenticity over adaptation, new moments when the authentic self must assert itself against the gravitational pull of old patterns, new situations where the voice of truth must speak up against the chorus of convenient lies. This requires what Jung called moral courage, not the courage to fight others, but the courage to disappoint others, not the courage to attack what is false, but the courage to embody what is true, not the courage to change the world, but the courage to remain unchanged by the world, when remaining unchanged is what integrity requires. The authentic self learns to recognize the difference between the discomfort that comes from growth and the discomfort that comes from betraying yourself, between the anxiety that accompanies authentic risk and the anxiety that accompanies inauthentic safety, between the loneliness of being true to yourself and the loneliness of abandoning yourself for the illusion of connection with others. It discovers that the temporary discomfort of standing in your truth is always preferable to the chronic pain of hiding from your truth, that the clean pain of authentic living is always more healing than the toxic pain of inauthentic existence. This emergence requires learning a new language, not the language of performance and pretense that you learned in the theater of social acceptability, but the language of essence and truth that speaks itself through your authentic being. This language cannot be taught through instruction, but only through practice, cannot be learned through imitation, but only through the patient excavation of your own unique voice from beneath the accumulated sediment of others' voices that you have mistaken for your own. The authentic self speaks in metaphors drawn from its own experience rather than cliches borrowed from collective wisdom, responds to situations from its own deep knowing rather than from rehearsed reactions, creates solutions from its own creative well rather than from the limited menu of approved responses. This self has learned to trust the intelligence that lives in its own body, the wisdom that speaks through its own emotions, the guidance that whispers through its own intuition. It has discovered that it contains within itself all the resources necessary for navigating the complexity of human existence, all the tools required for the ongoing work of conscious living. But observe how this authentic self, precisely because it is no longer defending against its own truth, becomes simultaneously more boundaried and more open, more discriminating and more accepting, more self-contained and more intimately connected to life. The energy that was once spent in maintaining false presentations is now available for genuine presence. The attention that was once scattered across multiple identities, seeking approval in multiple contexts, is now concentrated in the singular focus of authentic being. The love that was once conditional upon receiving love in return is now flowing freely from its own inexhaustible source. This is the self that Jung recognized as the goal of the individuation process, not the inflation of ego that believes itself separate from and superior to others, but the integration of opposites that allows for authentic relationship both with oneself and with the world. The authentic self can love others precisely because it has learned to love itself, can serve others precisely because it has learned to serve its own deepest nature, can contribute to the collective precisely because it has claimed its individual truth. It has discovered that the path to genuine connection with others leads directly through the center of authentic relationship with yourself. The authentic self emerges not as a finished product, but as a living process, not as a static identity, but as a dynamic flow of conscious being that can respond freshly to each moment, rather than reacting from the old patterns of unconscious conditioning. It has learned to live from what Jung called the creative unconscious, that deep well of wisdom and possibility that becomes available when we stop trying to control our experience and start learning to dance with it, when we stop demanding that life conform to our expectations and start discovering what wants to emerge through our unique participation in the great mystery of existence. Here, in this emergence, begins the real work, not the work of becoming someone else, but the work of being yourself so fully that your very presence becomes a gift to the world, so authentically that your way of being gives others permission to find their own way of being, so completely that your life becomes a demonstration of what is possible when a human being dares to live from the truth that lives at the center of their own being rather than from the lies that live at the periphery of others' expectations. When one soul dares to choose itself authentically, the tremor moves through the invisible web that connects all human hearts, like ripples spreading from a stone thrown into still water. The choice to honor your own truth does not happen in isolation. It happens in the field of relationship, in the context of community, in the midst of a collective unconscious that has grown accustomed to the comfortable predictability of mutual self-abandonment. And so, your authenticity becomes not just a personal healing, but a collective invitation, not just an individual transformation, but a crack in the consensus reality that allows new light to enter the shared darkness of human conditioning. Jung understood that individuation serves the whole precisely because it serves the individual so completely. Each person who becomes whole contributes to the healing of the human family. Each soul that learns to love itself authentically gives permission for others to examine their own patterns of self-rejection. Each being that stops seeking approval outside itself creates space in the collective field for others to discover the approval that has always lived within their own hearts. The ripple effect begins not with what you do, but with who you become. Not with your actions, but with your presence. Not with your words, but with the quality of being that radiates from someone who has made peace with their own ground. Watch how your choice to honor yourself sends shockwaves through the systems of relationship that have organized themselves around mutual accommodation of wounds. The family dynamics that depended upon your willingness to be the one who gives more than you receive. The friendships that existed in the comfortable space of shared complaint rather than shared growth. The romantic partnerships that survived only so long as both parties agreed to remain smaller than their truth. All these begin to shift and reorganize themselves around the new frequency you are broadcasting, the new standard you are embodying, the new possibility you are demonstrating simply by being yourself without apology or explanation. Some relationships you discover cannot survive your authenticity. They were built upon the foundation of your self-abandonment, sustained by your willingness to prioritize others' comfort over your own truth, held together by your agreement to remain the version of yourself that fit neatly into others' expectations rather than the version that honors your own deepest nature. When you stop playing these unconscious roles, when you refuse to continue the familiar dance of codependency and people-pleasing, these relationships reveal themselves to have been not relationships at all, but unconscious contracts, not love, but mutual dependency, not connection, but shared avoidance of the more challenging work of authentic intimacy. The ending of such relationships, while painful, is also a liberation, not just for you, but for all parties involved. For in choosing to leave the familiar cage of inauthentic connection, you also free others to discover whether they are capable of meeting you in the more spacious territory of authentic relationship, whether they are willing to do their own work of self-encounter, rather than depending upon your self-abandonment to avoid facing their own patterns of avoiding themselves. Some will rise to meet this invitation. Others will turn away toward more familiar territories where the old games can still be played, where the old wounds can still be accommodated, where the old patterns of mutual unconsciousness can continue undisturbed. But observe the miracle that occurs in the relationships that can withstand the earthquake of your authenticity. These connections, shaken free from the false foundations of mutual people-pleasing, begin to reorganize themselves around truth rather than accommodation, around genuine care rather than codependent caretaking, around mutual respect for individual authenticity rather than mutual agreement to remain less than whole. These relationships discover depths that were impossible to reach when both parties were spending their energy maintaining false presentations, discover intimacy that was impossible to achieve when love was conditional upon agreeing to be someone other than who you really are. The people who can love you as you are not as you perform yourself to be, not as you present yourself when you are trying to earn approval, but as you actually are in your full complexity and contradiction. These people reveal themselves to be the true companions on the journey of conscious living. They do not need you to be perfect to love you, do not require you to be always strong to respect you, do not demand that you be always available to value you. They love you not despite your humanity, but because of it, not in spite of your struggles, but in recognition of the courage it takes to be human in a world that often seems to punish authenticity and reward performance. These authentic relationships become laboratories for the continued practice of being yourself. Safe spaces where you can continue to discover and express aspects of your truth that may still feel too tender or too radical for exposure in the broader world. They become mirrors in which you can see yourself reflected accurately, rather than through the distorting lens of others' projections or expectations. They become gardens where the seeds of your authentic self can take root and flourish, where the tender shoots of new growth can be protected, while they develop the strength to survive in less hospitable environments. But the ripple effect extends far beyond your immediate circle of intimate relationships. In every context where you choose to show up authentically, in your work, in your community, in casual encounters with strangers, you become a living demonstration of an alternative way of being human. You become proof that it is possible to be genuinely yourself without the world coming to an end, evidence that authenticity is not the dangerous force that the frightened ego believes it to be, but the healing presence that the wounded world desperately needs. Your willingness to speak your truth, even when your voice shakes, gives others permission to find their own voice. Your courage to set boundaries, even when setting boundaries disappoints others, demonstrates that love can include self-respect without becoming selfish. Your commitment to honoring your own needs, even when others pressure you to sacrifice yourself for their comfort, shows that taking care of yourself is not the opposite of caring for others, but the foundation that makes genuine care possible. Jung recognized that this ripple effect operates through what he called the collective unconscious, that shared psychic field in which all human beings participate, in which the healing of one contributes to the healing of all, in which the consciousness achieved by an individual becomes available to the collective, in which one person's courage to face their shadow gives others permission to examine their own darkness. One person's willingness to integrate their opposites creates space for others to heal their own internal splits. Each time you choose authenticity over approval, you cast a vote in the collective election between consciousness and unconsciousness, between truth and comfortable illusion, between love that liberates and love that imprisons. Each moment you refuse to abandon yourself for the promise of external validation, you contribute to the gradual shift in human consciousness, away from the tyranny of others' opinions toward the sovereignty of individual truth. Held in relationship with collective responsibility, the people who witness your journey from self-abandonment to self-respect find themselves questioning their own patterns of giving themselves away, examining their own unconscious contracts with approval addiction, considering whether the relationships in their own lives are based on truth or on mutual agreement to avoid the truth. They may not thank you for this disruption of their comfortable sleep, may not appreciate the way your authenticity illuminates their own inauthenticity, may resist the invitation to examine their own lives with the same honesty you have brought to examining yours. But seeds are planted nonetheless. Questions are raised that cannot be unasked. Possibilities are glimpsed that cannot be unseen. The example of your authentic living becomes a persistent invitation in their unconscious, a quiet voice that continues to whisper the possibility of another way of being, long after they have consciously dismissed your influence, long after they have returned to the familiar patterns of seeking approval and avoiding disapproval that once felt so natural to you as well. Some of these seeds will lie dormant for years before finding the right conditions for germination. Others will sprout immediately in the fertile ground of a psyche that was already prepared for change, but needed only the example of someone else's courage to give them permission to begin their own journey toward authentic living. Still others will be rejected entirely by consciousness, but continue to work at unconscious levels, gradually weakening the foundations of inauthentic living until some future crisis creates an opening for the truth that has been waiting patiently in the depths to finally emerge into the light. The transformation you have undergone, from someone who sought love by abandoning herself to someone who expresses love by honoring herself, becomes a map that others can follow, a proof of concept that what seems impossible to those still trapped in patterns of self-rejection is actually not only possible, but profoundly healing. Your life becomes a demonstration that the path from self-abandonment to self-respect is not theoretical but practical, not an abstract ideal but a lived reality, not a distant possibility but an immediately available choice that can be made in any moment by anyone willing to prioritize their own truth over others' comfort. But observe how this influence moves not through preaching or teaching or trying to convince others to follow your path, but simply through being so genuinely yourself that your very presence raises the frequency of every space you enter. People may not be able to articulate what is different about you, may not understand why they feel slightly more alive in your presence, may not recognize that your refusal to dim your own light has given them permission to shine a little brighter themselves, but they feel it nonetheless. The permission to be more authentic, the invitation to examine their own lives, the possibility of loving themselves as generously as they love others. This is how healing moves through the collective, not through force or persuasion, but through example, not through trying to change others, but through changing yourself so thoroughly that your transformation becomes an irresistible invitation for others to consider their own possibilities for growth. Jung understood that this is how consciousness evolves, one individual at a time, one authentic choice at a time, one person at a time discovering the courage to be themselves in a world that profits from their agreement to be someone else. Your journey from self-abandonment to self-celebration becomes part of the larger story of human awakening, your individual healing contributing to the collective healing, your personal transformation serving not just your own liberation, but the liberation of all those whose lives you touch directly and indirectly, consciously and unconsciously, in ways you will never fully know, but which ripple outward through the invisible network of human connection like light spreading through darkness, like warmth spreading through cold, like hope spreading through despair, like love spreading through the places where love has been forgotten but never truly lost. The circle completes itself not in the place where you began, but in the recognition that you never truly left, that all the wandering through landscapes of self-abandonment, all the exile in territories of others' expectations, all the long journey through the wilderness of seeking yourself in external mirrors was always leading back to the home that lived within you, waiting with infinite patience for your return. This is the sacred return that Jung understood as the ultimate destination of individuation, not the arrival at some distant shore of perfection, but the homecoming to wholeness that was always your birthright, always your deepest nature, always the ground from which you temporarily wandered, but to which you inevitably return. But observe the profound transformation in the quality of this return. You do not come back to relationship as the wounded person who once sought love by abandoning herself, nor as the defended person who learned to protect herself by rejecting others. You return as someone who has made the great journey into the depths of your own psyche and emerged with the treasure Jung called the pearl of great price, the integration of opposites that allows you to be both individual and collective, both separate and connected, both autonomous and intimately related to the web of life in which you participate. This return happens not from the place of need, but from the place of fullness, not from emptiness seeking to be filled, but from abundance seeking to be shared. You come back to the world of human relationship, carrying the wholeness you have discovered in the depths of solitude, offering the love you have learned to give yourself, extending the acceptance you have fought so hard to claim for your own complex and contradictory nature. The relationships you form from this place of inner completion are fundamentally different from the relationships you once sought from the place of inner fragmentation. They are based on choice rather than compulsion, on gift rather than transaction, on celebration rather than completion. Jung understood this sacred return as the completion of what he called the hero's journey, but not the heroism that conquers others, the heroism that conquers the false self, that once believed love could only be earned through the sacrifice of authenticity. Not the victory over external enemies, but the integration of internal opposites. Not the triumph that stands above others, but the wholeness that can stand with others in full recognition of their own wholeness, their own journey, their own sacred struggle to become who they truly are beneath the layers of who they have learned to be for others. The person who returns from the journey of choosing herself discovers that she can now love others without losing herself, because she has learned that true love does not require the dissolution of boundaries, but the conscious permeability of boundaries, not the abandonment of self, but the offering of authentic self, not the merging that erases individual identity, but the intimacy that celebrates the dance between two whole beings who choose to share their wholeness without sacrificing it. This is the love that includes rather than excludes the self, not the selfish love that serves only its own interests, but the self-full love that serves the highest interests of all involved by refusing to participate in the mutual self-abandonment that masquerades as devotion but actually diminishes everyone it touches. This love knows the difference between giving from abundance and giving from depletion, between serving others from strength and serving others from weakness, between supporting others' growth and enabling others' avoidance of growth. Watch how this integrated person moves through the world, no longer split between the public self that performs acceptability and the private self that holds the forbidden truths, but unified in a way that allows the same authentic presence to show up in every context, adapted to circumstances but not compromised by circumstances, responsive to others' needs but not responsible for others' feelings, caring deeply for others' well-being but not at the expense of her own well-being. This person has learned what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox creatively rather than collapsing into either-or thinking, to embrace both the need for solitude and the desire for connection, both the responsibility to care for others and the responsibility to care for herself, both the call to serve something greater than the ego and the call to honor the unique gifts that can only be expressed through the individual personality that has learned to love itself as the vehicle through which universal love expresses its particular flavor of caring. The sacred return brings with it the recognition that choosing yourself was never about becoming separate from others, but about becoming so whole within yourself that you can meet others in their wholeness rather than in their woundedness, so complete within yourself that you can offer genuine support rather than codependent rescue, so full within yourself that your love flows freely rather than strategically, given not because you need to receive, but because giving has become the natural expression of a heart that has learned to stay open even in a world that often rewards closed-heartedness. From this place of inner integration, Service to others becomes not a burden carried by the martyred ego, but a joy expressed by the authentic self that has discovered its unique gifts and learned to offer them without depletion, without resentment, without the hidden expectation that others should appreciate or reciprocate or validate the value of what is being freely given. This service arises from what Jung recognized as the creative principle that moves through individual consciousness when that consciousness has become aligned with its own deepest nature rather than with the demands of external approval. The relationships that form from this place of wholeness become laboratories for continued growth rather than hiding places from the challenges of authentic living. They become contexts in which both parties can continue to discover and express new aspects of their authentic selves, safe spaces where the ongoing work of integration can be supported and witnessed, sacred containers where the tender work of healing can continue without the added burden of having to protect others from the reality of that healing process. But notice how this return to relationship from the place of wholeness serves not just the individual but the collective, not just personal healing but the healing of the human family. Each person who learns to love themselves authentically creates more space in the world for authentic love. Each being who refuses to abandon themselves for others' comfort makes it easier for others to stop abandoning themselves. Each soul that chooses wholeness over fragmentation contributes to the gradual healing of the collective split between individual truth and collective belonging. Jung understood that this is how consciousness evolves, not through the enlightenment of isolated individuals, but through the return of integrated individuals to conscious participation in the collective, bringing the gifts of their individual healing back to the shared work of human awakening. The person who has learned to choose herself authentically does not withdraw from the world, but engages with the world more fully, offering her unique perspective and talents and vision, not as someone who has transcended the human condition, but as someone who has learned to embrace the human condition so completely that her very presence becomes a healing force. This is the ultimate paradox that Jung illuminated. In becoming most fully individual, you become most fully universal. In learning to love yourself most completely, you become capable of loving others most authentically. In choosing yourself most radically, you become most available for genuine service to something greater than the personal ego that once sought validation through self-sacrifice. The sacred return reveals that the journey inward and the journey outward were never separate journeys but aspects of the same spiral path that leads simultaneously toward individual wholeness and collective healing, toward personal authenticity and universal love, toward the unique expression of your particular gifts, and the recognition of your fundamental interconnection with all life. From this place of integration, every choice becomes both personal and political, both individual and collective, both a way of caring for yourself and a way of caring for the world. The boundary between self-love and love for others dissolves not through the abandonment of self, but through the expansion of what you recognize as self. Not through the sacrifice of individual truth, but through the recognition that individual truth and universal truth are two faces of the same reality, two expressions of the same creative principle that seeks to know itself through the countless forms of conscious being. The person who returns from the journey of choosing herself discovers that she has not become separate from the human family, but has learned to participate in the human family from a place of strength rather than woundedness, from fullness rather than emptiness, from love rather than need. She can offer genuine support to others' healing processes because she is no longer invested in others remaining wounded to validate her own identity as helper. She can celebrate others' successes because she no longer needs others to remain smaller to make herself feel larger. She can allow others to make their own mistakes because she has learned that love sometimes requires stepping back rather than stepping in, allowing rather than rescuing, trusting others' capacity for growth rather than protecting them from the challenges that growth requires. This sacred return is not a destination, but a way of being, not a final achievement, but an ongoing practice of living from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from authenticity rather than performance, from the deep well of inner resources rather than the shallow streams of external validation. It requires the daily choice to meet life from the place of integration rather than reactivity, to respond to challenges from the place of centered strength rather than wounded defensiveness, to offer love from the place of abundance rather than scarcity. Jung recognized that this return represents the goal not just of individual psychological development, but of human evolution itself, the movement from unconscious participation in collective patterns toward conscious choice about how to participate in the collective, from automatic reaction to life's challenges toward creative response to life's invitations, from the fragmented existence that splits self and other, individual and collective, personal and universal, toward the integrated existence that recognizes these apparent opposites as complementary aspects of the same living wholeness. The sacred return completes the circle by revealing that it was never actually a circle, but a spiral. You return to relationship, but at a higher level of consciousness. You return to love, but with a deeper understanding of what love actually is. You return to service, but from a more sustainable source of caring. You return to the human community, but as someone who has learned to be fully human rather than just acceptably human, authentically present rather than strategically positioned, genuinely available rather than compulsively helpful. In this return, you discover that choosing yourself was never the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in which your individual healing becomes part of the collective healing. Your personal transformation contributes to the transformation of the world. Your journey from self-abandonment to self-celebration becomes a map that others can follow on their own sacred journey home, to the wholeness that has always been waiting patiently at the center of their own being, ready to emerge the moment they find the courage to stop seeking themselves in others and start discovering the infinite treasure that lives in the depths of their own authentic heart.